This is the Unregistered podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. This is a show about ideas, people, and behaviors that are considered inappropriate, out of bounds, or beyond the pale. The things you're not supposed to talk about if you're a school teacher, a college professor, a businessman, a politician, a parent, a neighbor, or even a podcast host. These are the things you're not supposed to say or even think if you're a good liberal, a good conservative, or a good citizen. Each week, I'll interview a person who has something bad to say. They might be a journalist or a professor. They might be a porn star or a drug dealer. They might just be an ordinary person with an ordinary job who doesn't care about the rules of polite society. I'm not interested in breaking the rules just to be a troublemaker. I'm interested in people who break the rules of conventional thought and to expand the scope of what is possible to say in our society. I'm interested in people who make me think. To make this show what it is, I have to talk to people in person, face to face, not on Skype or on the phone. That means I have to travel around the country and find recording spaces wherever I go. That's expensive. And so far, this show is entirely supported by the contributions of listeners. So if you want to keep it going, please do me a favor and go to unregisteredunderground.com. When you become a subscriber there, you'll have access to a private Facebook group where you can talk with me and with guests from the show. You'll also get discounts on Unregistered and Renegade University merchandise. So again, to support this show and to keep it going, please go to unregisteredunderground.com. If all college professors were truly intellectually curious and honest, I would still love my chosen profession. If all college professors were not just willing but eager to understand ideas that were contrary to their own, I would still want to be among them. If all college professors were able to talk openly about their own lives, their own insecurities, their fears and desires, and be able to integrate that self-knowledge with their scholarly work, I would never have needed to start this podcast. Unfortunately, for me, for American higher education, and for the intellectual culture of this country, so far as I can tell, there is only one Glenn Loury. So I've been waiting for this moment for a long time. I am sitting in Glenn Loury's office at Brown University. And I've been waiting for this for a long time because I started listening to him about 3 years ago on his show, The Glenn Show, on Blogging Heads. And I thought, now I know why they kept him from me all those years. I had known his name and I had known roughly who he was for many, many years, but I had never read any of his work and I didn't really know what he had to say because in my world, meaning the academic left world, no one talked about his work seriously. I guess if he was mentioned, it was mostly dismissively, but we didn't... Certainly, we're never instructed to read any of his work. None of his work was assigned to us in all those classes I took at Antioch College, at Columbia University. It was never in discussion, in conversations outside of the classroom. And so I just assumed he was just one of those black conservatives that makes the culture of poverty argument, and we don't need to address that because we know it's wrong. So, as a lot of you know, I somewhat agree with Glenn's argument on the culture of poverty thesis, but I also have some challenges to it, which we will get into a minute. But I just want to say that when I discovered you, Glenn, on your show, The Glenn Show, a few years ago, I started pumping my fist in the air and yelling. And right now, my girlfriend, when she sees this happening, when I have my headphones on, she says, "Oh, are you listening to Glenn again?" And it's true. So I just have not heard anyone... be as good a public intellectual, be as good an intellectual in public as this man. And I'll just tell you why. You can watch him yourself, but I've never encountered an academic who is as open to opposing ideas as he is, and more than that, who will actually present the best version of an opposing argument as he can. It's called, I think Sam Harris coined a phrase for what you do. He calls it steel manning as opposed to straw manning, and I absolutely agree with that. Pretty much every episode of The Glenn Show, you do that at least once. You present an argument on the other side of an issue so well that for a second there, a lot of the audience, including me, assumes that you maybe have switched your minds and we get a little panicky and then you come right back. It is, that is being That is being a true intellectual. Taking other ideas, not taking other ideas, taking ideas seriously. And when you do that, you get so passionate, you start yelling sometimes. And that's my favorite part. There's 2 times, I'll tell you, there's 2 times when you start, there are 2 times when you start yelling. I'll tell you when they are. It's when you really get into an argument and get frustrated that your argument is being strawmanned or not taken seriously, or there appears to be a history of that happening to you, and you start to narrate that history, and your feelings about that come out, and that's when you start to yell. But when you really yell, there's a couple times in the last couple of years when you yelled so loud it kind of blew out the audio on the show. It's when you talk about how you have been treated, I think, but really black people in these elite colleges like the one we're sitting in have been treated or are treated. And the moment that there was one moment when you didn't say it, you yelled it. You said, "We just want to be treated like a man." And you started talking about, or you had been talking about, how blacks generally, I don't think you talked about yourself, and I'm really curious about this actually, how blacks generally in these places are patronized. And your word is patronization, and you use that over and over again. And, I have seen that firsthand for as long as I've been in these places, which is now 30 years, 35 years as a student, as a graduate student, as a faculty member. I've seen it done to black students. I've seen it done to black faculty. I've seen it done to black administrators. I've seen it done to black people generally. And I have, as everyone knows, I have a lot of anger toward the academic left for a lot of reasons, but that's the one that really gets me. So when you did that, when you yelled that, I don't know. It felt to me like historic. It felt like maybe finally this is being told, this sort of open secret on these campuses, and maybe now we can start talking about it, and maybe something can be done about it. But anyway, Glenn, thanks for being here. I don't know. How's that for an introduction?
What to say? I don't know, but I appreciate it. It's all very encouraging. I'm glad to be able to talk with you here.
Yeah. So when I walked into the office 20 minutes ago, he forgot we were going to have this interview, I think, and didn't know why I was here and wanted to know who I was and what this podcast was about. And I said, and it seemed as if he didn't believe me when I started telling him these nice things. And he said, your flattery will get you 60 minutes with me. And I said, well, I think, let me try to prove that I'm not just flattering you. And I think, hopefully I've done that.
You've done that, Thaddeus.
Okay, good. Now let's get into the stuff, if you don't mind. Yeah, I want to talk about your story, your personal story, and I've heard you narrate your history in other places, which was just stunning. But what I want to do, which I haven't heard you do, just because you haven't been asked, as far as I know, I want you to see if we can connect more. You've done some of this, but connect more of your history to your current ideas, or your ideas as they've evolved. By the way, here's another thing I'm going to say about you. People who have actually changed their minds about big ideas, about big issues, big topics, another hallmark of a great intellectual. I mean, those people are few and far between. I've changed my mind, and you're one of the few others who I've seen do that, and we can talk about that, but it's quite a thing. So, all right, I'm going to let you talk now.
Okay.
You're from Chicago, right?
Chicago, Illinois, South Side.
South Side.
Yeah.
You mean the white part?
No, well, there are white and black parts on the South Side. I think there still are. There certainly were.
I was kidding.
In the 50s and 60s.
You're not from Hyde Park, right?
No, I'm not from Hyde Park. I'm from a community that was called Park Manor, or Chatham. They're closely located, those two neighborhoods. It's maybe 3 miles southwest of the University of Chicago's campus in Hyde Park, near the Dan Ryan Expressway. When I was coming along, it was a changing neighborhood that quickly became an all-black neighborhood, stable middle-class neighborhood, mostly single-family homes and small-scale apartment buildings, lawns in front, and people riding their bicycles up and down. So this is the 50s and 60s.
Right.
It's you know, it's Death Valley now. I mean, these neighborhoods have very high crime rates, homicide and stuff. These are the areas in Chicago, among the areas in Chicago that are troubled now with the high levels of violence. But yeah, I grew up in Chicago in the 50s and 60s.
I remember you talking about your father a little bit, but what did your parents do for a living?
So my dad retired as a high-level manager in the Internal Revenue Service. He was a federal bureaucrat. Senior Executive Service, which is a sort of elite cadres of bureaucratic managers within the agencies. He was with the IRS. But when I was born, he was working his way through college, going to night classes and working as a postal worker. He was a high school graduate trying to get a BA in accounting, which he eventually got, and he ended up with also a night school at the Kent Law School in Chicago, getting his law degree, and admitted to the bar, specializing in tax law, and had a career with the Internal Revenue Service. My mother and father were divorced when I was fairly young, so I did not grow up in my dad's household. I grew up with my mother and her family, but I saw my father on a regular basis, and he was definitely an important part in my life.
So, stable middle class? Is that how you would describe
it? Lower middle class. I mean, it was variegated, but yeah, I was not the first person in my family to go to college. My mother's brother was a graduate of Morehouse in the late 40s, and went on to Northwestern University Law School and did very well there. Was a classmate of the late Harold Washington, who was the first African-American mayor of Chicago. He and my uncle were in law school together at Northwestern. My uncle crashed and burned, unfortunately. He ended up getting disbarred because he got caught up in some shady dealing and drank himself to death at the age of 63 or something crazy like that. But he was a brilliant man. My mother's sister and her husband were small business people. They ran a dry cleaning concession, and my uncle was a barber. It was in their house, their spacious, comfortable home, that I grew up as a kid, because my mother's sister took her, my mother and her children, myself and my sister, took us in at a difficult time in my mother's life, and we basically grew up in my aunt and uncle's house. And it was, as I say, a spacious house with a nice green backyard and a safe, quiet, tree-lined street in a stable middle-class African-American neighborhood on the south side.
Can you talk about what your mother's troubles were?
Yeah, I mean, I don't mind talking about them if I could fully grasp them. She's no longer with us. She died in 2003. My mother was married 4 times and had intermittent lovers between these marriages. And I don't know if you know that old Papa was a Rolling Stone. Wherever he laid his hat was his home. And when he died, all he left us was alone. This is old school lyric. And Mama was a bit of a Rolling Stone. And beautiful woman, gorgeous, vivacious, kind to a fault. She'd give you the shirt off of her back, sang like a nightingale. Actually had a little career as a nightclub singer before my father put an end to that when she was younger. But she wasn't the most responsible mother. And I had been to 5 different elementary schools before completing the 5th grade. And when my aunt saw the kind of instability in our lives as my mother was moving between relationships and between physical locations with finances being shaky, she said, "These kids need some stability. I want you to come here with your children and live with me." And my mother acceded to that. And that was when things started coming together for me in the 5th grade. And,
What kind of music did she sing?
Sarah Vaughan, Ella Fitzgerald, Nancy Wilson, this kind of She sang show tunes. She loved Sinatra. She loved Tony Martin and Tony Bennett, I should say, and Lou Rawls and stuff like. She loved these ballads and whatnot. But she also sang some church stuff. She sang, His Eye is on the Sparrow kind of hymns, and would hit those high C's and would run those scales and arpeggio those chords. I mean, she had real talent and had a little bit of training, but she didn't have the discipline. She didn't stick with it.
Huh. But she was singing mostly American standards.
Yeah, she was singing American standards. Yeah. In the kitchen while she was cooking or at the ironing board, pressing the clothing or whatever. She would just let out. And there was always something on the turntable.
That's what my mother sings, American standards.
Uh-huh.
She loves that music, and that's all she knows, and that's all she cares about. She doesn't like any other music at all. And I get it, because I love it too, but...
Well, there is other music.
There is other music. So it sounds like there was a church involved in your childhood?
My mother wasn't especially a church goer. She sang the canon. I mean, these were tunes that she had learned. There was church. My aunt was a staunch member of the Bethel AME, African Methodist Episcopal Church in Chicago on Michigan Avenue. It's still there. And the pastor would sometimes come to the house for Sunday dinner, and my aunt would see that my cousins, my sister, and I got on the bus and got ourselves over to Sunday school most Sunday mornings, because you could take a 30-minute bus ride from where we lived, and it was a 5-minute walk to the church from the bus stop. She'd see us, and then she'd want to know, did we go to the service, and what was the sermon about? She'd interrogate us a little bit when we came home, but it wasn't religious. I mean, it wasn't like every Sunday, and it wasn't preachy. It wasn't a whole lot of, God, if you don't do this, you don't do that. Blessing would be said before a meal. It would be very odd to take food without us thanking God for it. And theism, atheism would have been a very, would have been an eccentricity.
to say the least.
To say the least. I guess you know about that.
As it is. So I was raised in an atheist household, as a matter of fact. But
yeah.
But in that context, in Berkeley in the 1970s, it wasn't so eccentric. But in that,
right.
in your context, I can imagine it would have been.
Yeah.
Well, oh yeah, right. Well, but the kids in my neighborhood, who I was telling you about, I think before, black kids in my neighborhood, when I would run around telling them that there was no God, they didn't take too kindly to it.
but it's not so much that people would have thought it odd as that it would have been incomprehensible. I mean, what do you mean you don't believe in God? I mean,
I got some of that too, but I also got pummeled a few times for it.
Well, sorry about that. Thanks.
No, that's good. I learned how to fight instead. It's all right. It all worked out. So we're talking about the 50s and then early 60s?
In Chicago, growing up, middle class, more or less middle class African American. I mean, there were gangbangers and hoodlums around. I mean,
sure.
who were friends of family and stuff like that.
Yep.
Junkies and hookers. I mean, these people passed through at the parties and in the thing. And if my mother was letting a room because there was extra room in the house, the person where their money came from wasn't always clear. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't like a bright line between, legitimacy and illegitimacy. There was a lot of going back and forth across the line.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, yeah. In my studies, I shall say, of these neighborhoods at that time, and I have studied I've studied that neighborhood in that time. That's exactly what I've seen, is a lot of blurry lines. So, I mean, one of the theses in my work is that among, especially working class African Americans, and I'm not, with your family, it sounds like that's not so clear where a social scientist would place them in the class hierarchy, but it sounds like culturally it's all blended there, right? And that's
it's all blended.
That's kind of interesting in itself, right? So it's hard to pigeonhole you, isn't it?
Already. I remember my uncle taking me to Joliet, which is where Statesville, where the local prison, regional prison, Illinois State Penitentiary was located. He was going to visit. I sat in the car in the parking lot and waited for him to go, and he went in and came out to visit his friend. I couldn't go. But when he came back to the car and I complained about having to wait so long, and he explained that his friend, he had been in business together with his friend, and his friend got caught. He says, that could have been me. I could be sitting there and he could be out here in the parking lot. It just so happened that he was the one who got caught. We were basically in the same business together. Don't you look down your noses at somebody because they're locked up. Getting over, hustling, making it. You try growing up in the Depression in Chicago being a black man and see how easy it is. It ain't that easy.
Oh, where did your parents come from originally?
Well, my mother and father were both born in Chicago, but both of their families had come from the South. My mother's mother was born in Brookhaven, Mississippi, and she, along with 8 or 9 of her siblings, migrated from Brookhaven, Mississippi to Chicago. They came in waves. They didn't all come at one time.
The so-called Great Migration?
Yeah, this was a part of the Great Migration right after the First World War. This would have been in the late 19-teens and early 1920s when these people... My mother was born in Chicago in 1928.
Okay.
My father was born in Chicago in 1929, and his people had come from New Orleans, a mulatto kind of Negro background in New Orleans, and also from Tennessee.
Mulatto in New Orleans at the time usually meant middle or even upper class. Is that possible? Do you know about this?
Well, I do know that I do know that's not in my father's family. They didn't have too much, but because his mother was a single mom and lived with her father, his grandfather. There were light-skinned people in that family who were passing for white, who well might have had money, but we didn't have a whole lot of contact with them. But my dad was a self-made man. I mean, his mother died when he was 12 years old. He kind of worked his way through high school, let alone college. Any little spending money he got, it was because he had a paper route or something. He was raised by his grandfather. My father, after his mother died, was raised by his grandfather, his mother's father. And his grandfather was a man with a 4th grade education who had a very good job on the railroad. He was gone 3-4 days at a time, but he was getting paid regular and getting paid good by the Illinois Central Railroad.
Was he a porter?
He was not a porter. I think he was some kind of, I don't know what you would call them, guys that stoked the fire on the steam engine or whatever. I mean, he was a manual laboring type guy. He only had a 4th grade education. He was not particularly smooth, elegant man. He was a pretty crude man, pretty gruff man. Pretty coarse man, but he was disciplined, hardworking, took care of his family, made a decent living, kept a roof over their heads. My father's grandfather.
So first of all, I didn't know a lot of this. I haven't heard much of this, and the first thing that comes to mind is even your history and your back history is very difficult to pigeonhole. It's hard to categorize you already. You haven't even been born yet. And I think about all the categories we put, especially African Americans in, but we kind of do it to everybody. But the one thing I'm thinking about, though, is I keep thinking about your mother's song preferences. And you know what I mean by this, but a lot of people listening probably don't. But the shorthand that we use in academia about this is, respectability, that term. And I'm curious about, first of all, if you want to talk about it, what you think of that category, which is perfectly fine with me. But, what was the attitude of your mother, your father, people around you, your family, toward things like the idea of a nuclear family? That seems already kind of troubled because there's all sorts of very interesting movement. You end up with your aunt and uncle. That's one, and then another big one, 2 other big ones. There's one is work. What was their attitude toward work? Did they think of it just as a means to an end or as a good thing in itself? I think I know the answer to that, but I want you to answer it. And then the third one is sexuality. So that's my work. That's the work that I've done.
That's a lot. Okay, we got the nuclear family, we got work, and we got sexuality. So we're talking about the mores or values of this particular cultural niche. So 50 years ago.
Yeah, it's about their relationship to what's now called, traditional American values, right?
I don't know quite how to. That's a big question. I think lip service was given to values that might have been, sort of honored in the breach or something like that. I mean, that there was a lot of adultery and a lot of fooling around, man.
In the family.
Yeah, I mean, I'm talking about my mother. I'm talking about she had 4 husbands and lovers in between, and there was a lot of. So here was a joke that she often told. So the couple are sitting at the kitchen table trying to have dinner, and the phone rings, and she gets up and goes to the phone, And she talks for a minute, and then she comes back. And the phone rings again 5 minutes later, and she gets up again and goes, and it's a brief conversation, and seems like someone's got the wrong number, and she hangs up and she calls and comes back. Finally, after it happens a third time, she comes back, and her husband says, well, what's going on there? And she says, somebody thinks this is the Weather Bureau. They've got the wrong number. He says, what makes you say that? Because they keep asking, is the coast clear? Okay. So the drama of is the coast clear? Were we going to actually meet up there at the tavern on the corner at 8 o'clock because he had a 7 o'clock shift, but maybe he got canceled or he called in sick today and whatever, was just a constant part of my life. I mean, this kind of stuff was going on. Everybody, it seemed, was doing it. Now, that is just my little corner of Chicago circa 1965, but a lot of people were fooling around. There was just a lot of stuff going on. In my family anyway. Still, my mother insisted when my girlfriend became pregnant. She was 15 when she became pregnant and 16 when she gave birth to our daughter Lisa, my firstborn, that I marry that girl. She insisted on it. I was a college student. The year was 1966. I had graduated high school in 1965. I was 18 years old in September of 1966, and Lisa was born in March of 1967. And my mother insisted that I marry that girl. It took me a while to get around to doing it. The second child came, Tammy. But Charlene and I did eventually marry with these two daughters and start a household. And the idea that I would have done anything other than that was absolutely unacceptable to my mother. My father, on the other hand, took the view that, this is now talking about family. This is one of the three things that you asked me to address. My father took the view that you can be a father to your children without having to be a husband to that girl. He meant no disparagement of the girl, but he thought an early marriage was probably unwise. I think he might have had his own unhappy experience in mind, as he was 19 when I was born, and he and my mother married, and it didn't work out. They were together only for a few years. Charlene, my first wife, the mother of Lisa and Tamara, a wonderful woman, and we loved each other and so on, but we were temperamentally and perhaps professional is the wrong way to put it, but in terms of life courses and whatnot like that, not especially suited. I mean, I was destined to go on to an academic career and whatnot. I didn't see it at the time, but in retrospect, I can see it was in the cards, and that was not her thing. Is. As I say, a fine person, but not, we weren't especially well matched. And there were other problems as well. So it didn't work out. Maybe my dad was right. But there was value to if this is what respectability is partly about, to the idea of, those are your children, marry that girl. I was able to get a job at the printing plant. R. Donnelly and Sons was a big printer in Chicago at that time. Found the job in like a week, paying $600 a month, which was not a bad wage in 1967 for somebody who was a college dropout and whatnot. And I started working, taking care of my family. Homosexuality was perverse. Mm-hmm. I mean, faggot was a word that was just used. I mean, what? I mean, a person was, that's what they would have said. I'm just telling you, I'm not endorsing it. I'm just reporting to you
I know what you're doing.
What the attitude was in 1965 Chicago, 1970 Chicago. It was, I mean, and there were, of course, gay people in that universe, and they were some of them beloved members of the family, but they were exotic, they were weird, they were sissies, and they did sissy stuff. And if you were a normal guy, you didn't want to be a sissy. I mean, you didn't want to be called, thought, looked upon as, or whatever. I mean, that was just the way it was. Now, I say this here in the year 2017 with my son, Glenn, who's 28 years old, a gay man living with his partner, Rob, and I expect they will marry at some point, although I'm leaving that up to them to sort out for themselves. But they're a very stable couple together, and I love Glenn, and Glenn has had a difficult road to the happy and stable and well-adjusted life that he now enjoys. I'm very happy for him, and I'm saying all that just to say, in case he should be listening to this podcast, that I don't have a problem with him being gay, and it's all good, man. We've come a long way, baby. But the Chicago that I grew up in the 1960s, nah.
So I know you don't know this, but you are talking to the leading historian of black drag queens.
Oh, am I?
You are.
No, I didn't know that. Come on, get out of here, man.
Yeah. And if you don't believe me, you can go on your computer right now and look at
I'm going to take your word for it for the time being, but I will check later.
The American Quarterly Academic Journal published my article on that very topic. I mean, that's a major part of the article, but yes. And I've been told by the editor that it's the most downloaded article in the journal's history, but...
Okay, so here, wait a minute. I just want to get my mind around this. Here, I've got the guy who's the world's leading historian on black drag queens who can't get a job in a history department somewhere.
Oh, maybe you want to look. Glenn, have you not been looking at me this whole time?
All right, that's a subject for another conversation.
Oh no,
Thaddeus is reminding me that he's white, and a white guy can't be a student of black drag queens in today's academy. He's going to maintain.
Yeah, it didn't help me at all with that. But
that's an outrage. But
yeah, no. Well, whatever. We will talk about that.
Okay.
We don't have to talk about my experience with that, but I definitely want to talk about that. But no, So, you were born in 1948, correct?
Correct.
And so that means by 1960, you were only 12 years old.
Right.
So you kind of missed this. Now, of course, I wasn't there, so I only know it through, the research. And did your family read Ebony and Jet?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It was around all the time. My uncle had a barbershop.
Okay.
That was what was laying there for the people to read, and it was always coming to the house. Ebony and Jet, man. They kept the back issues, too. Sometimes as a kid, I'd go and look through them because they were photo magazines. And the Jet was nice, a small little thing you could put in your pocket. It fit in your hand, No story was more than 500 words, so it wasn't too taxing to read that magazine.
So I was told by the editor of American Quarterly that I was the first person to ever use Ebony and Jet as archival material, source material, that no historian or cultural studies person had ever used those sources, which is pretty shocking to me.
That is shocking. And what year was this?
I submitted it in 2007 or 8.
Oh, that's stunning. That's hard to believe, actually. Because they must all be there. Johnson Publishing.
It's all on microfilm at every university in this country. It's all been right there. Every single issue. Don't even have to look very far for it. So by 1960, this all makes sense now. I can't obviously speak to your own experience or your own family or any of that, but I can tell you this because I've read it. By 1960, when you were probably conscious enough to know what was in those magazines, this was gone. But from 1946 and 7 to about 1957 or 8, almost every week in both Jet and Ebony, there was a major middle feature full of photos, usually 2 or 3 pages long, many, many photos of that week's drag ball in Chicago, in Harlem.
Is that right?
In New Orleans.
Every week?
Detroit. Almost every week.
Drag ball?
Drag balls.
Centered photo section in the magazine showing people with their displaying their wares, as it were.
And
that's hard to believe.
These were all in black neighborhoods like Southside Chicago. That was a major center of the black drag, or I should say the drag scene, because
Does everybody know what a drag queen is?
Oh yeah, my listeners do.
Okay, well you need to tell me just so I know what you're talking about. I got the rough idea.
We got to historicize it. I'm a historian, right? So it's at the time it was simply men who dressed as women.
All right.
However, there were also drag kings who were women dressed as men, not just dressed as, but also adopting the behaviors of the traditional normative man or woman.
And this is apart from sex.
What do you mean?
I mean, this is dressing and self-presentation, or are people's sexual orientations, appetites, or practices different in virtue of them being drag queens or drag kings?
So most likely the vast majority at that time were considered homosexuals. If you know George Chauncey's work, the lines between gay and straight became hardened during World War II, but before then, in the 1910s, 20s, and 30s, there was all sorts of, now I'm thinking back about your family too, the lines were very blurred, so there were all these different categories. There were sissies and fairies and wolves and all these different categories that people employed, and some of them meant that you were mostly a heterosexual man, maybe even married, but sometimes you would, now we say, go down low, on the down low, have sex with a man every once in a while, but you were your identity was that of a heterosexual.
Yeah.
So, but after World War II, sort of the culture generally hardened those lines, and also that's the time in the 1940s and 50s when there's the very famous massive crackdown on homosexuality in America, but I say it was in white America mostly. So that was the time when they were purging all the homosexuals from all the federal jobs, and it was very difficult to get a job if you were considered to be a homosexual. This is when they would publicize all the homosexual men who were at the gay bar in the newspaper to shame them, etc. But what I found in my research was that right then, when you're growing up in that very neighborhood where you were, there was these drag balls all the time, and that Ebony and Jet, here's the important thing I left out, the coverage of those balls by Ebony and Jet when you were 5, 10 years old was almost always either neutral or even positive. Sometimes it would kind of poke fun at it, but it certainly wasn't a denunciation ever. And why else would they show it with all these pictures every single week? At that very same time, I don't know about Chicago, but in Detroit, there was a man named Prophet Jones. Were you aware of him? You ever heard of Prophet Jones?
Is this a evangelist?
He was, he's a Pentecostal preacher.
You know, I think I may have heard, but I couldn't give you chapter and verse.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, you just missed this.
But I know the type.
Yep.
But go ahead.
I know you do, yeah.
I mean, I know what a hustling, womanizing, big gold chain, but this guy was straight. This guy was, I mean, when I say straight.
Yeah. Right.
He was, anyway.
No, Prophet Jones was a faggot.
Oh, my Lord.
And everybody knew
openly and straight out.
Well, he didn't hide it. He lived with his boyfriend in a mansion that he painted a different color every season of the year. Right? Right? And he wore mink coats, and he had a big old, what we would now call pimp hat all the time. He sat on a throne in his church,
this
which
is
was
news to me.
Encrusted in jewels. Well,
so what was this, a gospel of prosperity or something? He was telling people that Jesus was going to bless them?
He was gospel of prosperity. The thing I really liked about him was he was also the gospel of leisure. He said that heaven is where there is no work, that we will just live a life of leisure when we're in heaven. And of course, his congregation was 100% not only black, working class, and poor, but migrants from the South at the time. But they gave him a lot of money. They donated a lot of money to him, and that's how he got all this money. But he was in jail by the time you were 12 years old in 1960, because what happened was in Detroit, C.L. Franklin, who was Aretha's father, who was kind of the big civil rights leader minister in that town then, he had a cop in the Detroit Police Department, a young black cop, go to Prophet Jones's house and offer to give him a blowjob. And then he was arrested for sodomy. And they brought him down and destroyed him. But before the 1950s, from about 1946, 47 to 57, 58, Prophet Jones was arguably he was probably the most famous black person in the country. Maybe only Jackie Robinson was more famous at that time, maybe Joe Louis. But certainly this is true. He was the most famous and popular black minister or preacher at that time among African Americans.
This is interesting.
He was on the cover of Life magazine.
Wow.
He had a major radio show.
Yeah.
He was on TV. He had, we don't know for sure, but probably hundreds of thousands of congregants sort of scattered around the country. He was a celebrity. Oh, guess who else was in every week of Jet and Ebony at that time? Prophet Jones. And mostly celebratory coverage until he got busted.
Interesting.
But everybody knew he was gay. Everybody called him a faggot. But often, it seems, not with terrible derision when they used that term referring to him. But So I stumbled upon, or I found this whole world among working class African Americans in those particular neighborhoods at the time, and it seemed to me that the lines between homosexual and heterosexual and good and bad were more blurry in that world than in the larger dominant white culture. It's very interesting. So, and then other scholars have commented on this, including James Baldwin, by the way. But various others have sort of seen this, but only anecdotally. But I actually found the evidence that there was much more sort of acceptance, I guess is a word I would use, of homosexuality among African Americans than whites at that time, at least, which of course runs counter to what everybody thinks about African Americans now, which is that they're the most homophobic. I just think it's more complicated. But anyway, I just was fascinated that you were a kid then, right there. It's just that you were a little too young to know. This actually might be important. You became a conscious person after all this is thrown out. So after 1958, there is no mention of the drag balls or Prophet Jones. Sweet Daddy Grace was another one, by the way. You may know about him.
That name I know.
Very similar, although heterosexual, but
Was
otherwise.
he Philadelphia?
He was the whole Atlantic seaboard he had churches from Miami all the way to Maine.
Yeah.
And he was mostly heterosexual, but otherwise he was very similar. Had 6-inch long fingernails that were painted red, white, and blue. And he made sure he always had a white chauffeur. So, these were,
My people.
well, here you go. So that's what I presented, that paper, that work, to Barnard College to get the job, the tenure track job, in the field that I was teaching at that college at the time and had been for 5 years. And the civil rights leaders of the time, I didn't mention this part, but not just C.L. Franklin, but even Martin Luther King indirectly, but all of them basically agreed that these people have got to go, because if we're going to get citizenship in this country, we have to show, and these were the words they used, and this is really what I want to get to with you. These were the words they used at that time. We have to be just like them. We have to show that we can be just like them. I don't know if you know about King's
Well, that's ironic,
sermons.
given King's, profligacy in the field of womanizing, on my understanding from the guy out at Stanford who's the curator of those papers.
Clay Carson.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I'm not a historian, so I don't know, but I mean, I gathered that King was, there was a damsel in every port.
Yeah, well,
or three.
So Martin Luther King, who insisted that black people get married and stay married and live in a nuclear family and not just work hard, but believe that work is virtuous, and said that homosexuality was a sin, and even that rock and roll was a sin. That's what he said. He gave these sermons in 56 and 50.
I had never heard that.
Yeah.
But he outgrew that, I assume.
I know. When I presented this, some very famous faculty at Columbia University historians told me that I was making this up. And I said, Clay Carson has put those papers online. Let me Google it for you right now. I'll show it to you, with King's handwriting even. And this is not even controversial among historians who've done the work, but the civil rights movement basically not conspired, but they made sure to shut down this whole scene, this quite large. The other thing I didn't mention is those drag balls were remarkable. This is Jim Crow in the North era, right? When these are very segregated places, even in the North, right?
Yeah.
They were phenomenally interracial. In fact, they were probably the most integrated spaces in the United States at that time. If you look at the pictures, you will see not just men dressed as women dancing with other men, black men dressed as women. You will see a black man dressed as a woman dancing with a white man dressed as a woman in 1949, 50, 51, 52. I mean, so this is...
Well, if you were a white guy who wanted to dress as a woman, what better scene to show up at than the drag ball over in Harlem or the South Side or whatever?
So,
because it's going to be a blast.
That's another thing I was going to ask you about. So, one of the reasons all of the gay bars, especially the nightclubs where these things would happen, were located in neighborhoods like yours, was that there were fewer cops there. Before the 1960s, right? And I know you know about this. Before the 1960s, those neighborhoods were largely unpoliced. Because I think this is true. I think it's been borne out by the evidence. I think Baldwin's talked about this actually. Because,
who cares?
Well, right. So it's ironic, right? The racists were the ones who left black people alone, right? That's a story we'll hopefully get into, but how that changed later. It's one of the great ironies that's never talked about. So I am thinking, you said that Martin Luther King, you were surprised that King had these views about sexuality when he was having all these affairs with women. And I thought that what King demonstrated in doing that was that it's really hard, really, really hard, maybe impossible, to be monogamous for life with one person. And your mother is another demonstration of that, sounds like. That she...
Are you making that as a general claim about the human condition?
Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, not that...
I don't think I can contradict you in that respect.
I know you can't, because I wanted to say also to you, I was going to say this at first, congratulations.
Oh, thank you, Thaddeus.
You announced... I think it's okay to say this because you announced it publicly last week.
That it's on my Facebook page, in fact. So.
Yeah, that you're getting married.
I am on October 6th in Houston, Texas, to a beautiful woman who was just trying to call me, but I've asked her to wait until our interview is complete.
Please apologize
no
for
problem.
me.
I'll apologize for you. No problem. She'll call back.
Yeah. So, and it's your third, right?
It is. My second wife passed away from breast cancer 6 years ago, and my first wife and I were together for about 5 years before we split up.
Yeah, it's hard, right? I'm divorced also, and it is hard.
It's especially hard if you don't try. Monogamy. Mm-hmm. I assume that's what you meant was hard.
It's hard when you do try.
Yeah.
Don't you think? I'm sure you tried at some point.
Well, at this point in my life, I'd like to think that Ms. Sadler and I will be happily ensconced and content in our monogamous relationship until one of us departs.
So,
but then maybe I'm fooling myself.
Well, here's the reason for optimism. You know, I was divorced when I was in my 40s, and now I'm 51, and now I'm thinking, because I'm in a relationship now, we're not married, but it's almost like a marriage. I'm thinking, okay, we have a chance because we started so late. You know, we have less time to make this work for the rest of our lives. So I think you've got an advantage there, but that it's just hard. It's really it's striking that.
Can I say something?
Sure, please.
This is a little personal revelatory, but I know that's what you want.
Mm-hmm.
So, when I was coming along, I'm Glenn Loury, so my middle name is my mother's maiden name, Cartman. They were the Cartmans. My mother, her two brothers, and sister. It was in her sister's house that we grew up. Well, her two brothers were were wonderful people, amazing. I mentioned her brother, who was the lawyer who finished Northwestern University Law School, very erudite and educated and sophisticated man. He was also a notorious womanizer. I mean, there was a church social club called the Sorelit Guild, Social, Religious, and Literary Guild of the Bethel AME Church, which my aunt presided over as, chairwoman for many years. And it was rumored in the back talk in our family that my uncle had gone through every single one of the dozen or so women who constituted the core group of the whatever. So the Cartmans and my uncle Alfred, his brother, my mother's brother too, had overlapping families of concurrent, he was polygamous basically, and, 22 children altogether who now have a family club, which they call the Cartman Connection. All 22 of these kids are in touch with each other. Wow. My uncle passed away a few years ago, but they're still keeping the thing going strong. And there are 22 of them. The 12 Roses, those are the 12 of his children with Rose. The Magnificent Seven, those are the 7 of his children with Mary Bell. The Dynamic Duo, those are the 2 with Betty. And what is the... she has also a designation, the one who was born the one child to another mother. In other words, the Cartmans were like sowing their seed hither and yon. Okay, so that's my mother's side of the family. Now my father, and I told you about his grandfather who raised him, was as straight-laced as you could possibly want to be. This dude, He's still living, bless his heart, in Gainesville, Florida right now. He's going to be 88 on his next birthday. He was the lieutenant colonel of the high school ROTC group. Spit and polish, crease in his pants, hair cut close all the time, disciplined. He lost his mother when he was 12 years old. There was no extra money around. He worked for everything that he ever had. You talk about work, man. This guy had a real work ethic. I mean, it was 20 hours a day. He always said to me, I'm a C student, and I know I'm a C student, but damn it, I'm going to get through to the end. You can do this stuff standing on your head, and you're frittering away your talents messing around here. And it was like this, I don't know, you know the novels of Thomas Mann, the German guy, you know, about the Italian and the Germanic, you know, and you got the swarthy Mediterranean kind of, you know, fluidity in the human condition. You know, they love the food, they love the sex, they love the music and the dance, and it's a ribald kind of scene. And you got these tight, you know, Hamburg kind of, you know, business-oriented, hyper-efficient, self-critical, neurotic Germans.
Yep.
Well, it's like the Cartmans were the Italians. And the Loury side of my family was like the Germans. And I'm some kind of hybrid of the two, flits wildly back and forth between one or the other persona. I'm inflating this a little bit, but this is not far off.
Yeah.
It was interesting, and always it wasn't just one thing. It wasn't just a single note that was either here or there. It was some interesting stuff going on.
That's what I'm hearing. Hybrid is a really great word for your whole background. But it's funny that you mentioned Italians, because you know what they used to say about Italians before you were born. They were black.
Yeah.
They were black according to America until about the World War II. But that's what you just described, that sort of conflict between the sensual and the disciplined, you just described all of my work. That's what I do. I do the history of the United States through that lens, or I try to find that particular conflict everywhere in American history, which for some reason most American historians just haven't been interested in. And I do.
Well, that conflict is very important to my life.
I know. That's why I'm here, Glenn. That's why I'm here. So let's do that. Yeah. So, you know, you're most famous, I think this is fair to say. It doesn't mean that this is what you most care about, but I think you're most famous for the argument that, I don't know how you would phrase it, but, you know, black culture, or the particular decisions of many black people, especially over the last 50 or 60 years, since you were 12 years old, right around then, is a primary cause of the ills that beset the neighborhoods we're talking about. That the 700 dead people in Chicago last year can be attributed, I think you would say, largely, or maybe entirely, I don't know, but certainly largely, I think you would say, to people's ideas, attitudes, beliefs about such things as work and sexuality and violence and law and order. Is that fair to say?
Okay. I certainly think people's attitudes, values, and beliefs about those things are consequential for the outcomes that are of concern to us. I wouldn't say that they are the only things driving those outcomes. I don't want to say that to the exclusion of material condition,
I know you did.
opportunity, and treatment by the outside society.
Right.
But I want not to overlook either the causal role that these cultural factors play, or the responsibility, this would be in my telling, that we as a community have to be mindful of and to address these factors to the extent that they leave bodies lying on the streets all around the south side of Chicago.
Right. Yeah. No, I've heard you qualify it very well, and you are not making an absolute claim about this. But I think what you're doing is you're making an intervention, a sustained intervention over many, many years in a field and in a world which largely ignores that or refuses to even acknowledge the argument that you're making. I know you know this. This is when you start yelling sometimes.
And it drives me crazy.
I know, and when you yell, I hear you, because even though I'm not 100% on board with you, I think your basic causal analysis is correct. I just want to unpack that culture a little bit more with you.
Okay.
That's all. And I think you now see why I've been setting this up so far as I have, talking about these things.
No, that's good. Let's go there. But let me just mention before we do that, and you used, talked about patronization. You used that word. You reminded me of my own use of it. And I mean, this is the thing that is driving me crazy. Okay, so I've got kids with guns, firing them out the windows of vehicles as they drive by, killing little babies sitting on the porch on their mother's lap. And this is not just happening once or twice. This is scores upon scores and becomes hundreds upon hundreds. I say, grow a conscience to the kid with the gun who's getting ready to take the life. I say these knuckleheads need to be confronted and called for what they are, which is violent criminals terrorizing their fellows. This is barbarity, I say. Okay? And someone says, in response to that, there's no opportunity. What do you expect? They don't have anywhere to go play basketball at midnight on a Saturday night. What do you expect? The world hates them. Didn't you see who just got elected president and what they say in their rallies? What do you expect? The cops are vicious thugs. What do you expect? I expect them to not shoot each other in the head. I expect them to act in a civil manner, is what I expect. You don't think they're capable of that? Oh, I see. The only people capable of exercising moral agency are the white people whom you're trying to get to increase the school budget or to do something about police training or to give some jobs program somewhere. The black people who are lying bleeding out on the curb somewhere aren't capable of doing anything other than being chits who are being pushed this way and that by historical forces beyond their control. They're human beings. They have will. They can shape their lives. This is negotiable. This is malleable. This is something we should be engaged in. You don't take them seriously. They're just your little baubles. They're your little Cupid dolls. You want to set them up and play with them like a little toddler in her playhouse somewhere. These are human beings that we're talking about. Their future is not determined by anything, certainly not by some material condition somewhere. Let's talk about making a new world there. This kind of thing like that. So you say you're a friend of black people? You say you're anti-racist? Well, I'm not persuaded by that.
Yeah, I mean, so what you said is you want to be treated like a man. And so what I see is, on campuses, black people being treated like, not so much like toys. Oh no, actually, I take it back. It's either, sometimes it's like toys and more often it's like children. Because the thing that when I have a black student in my classes, I go at them hard, but I go after all my students hard intellectually. So if they say something that needs some work intellectually, has some flaw in the logic or the premise is questionable, I do this to all my students and always have, and all of them who are listening know this. I treat them like I would treat you, Glenn. I treat them like intellectuals, like grown-up intellectuals. And meaning I'll call them on it and I'll say, no, give that to me back better. Give me that argument better. You know how to do it and you can do it. Let me hear it. And I will make them repeat it 3 or 4 times in a classroom until they get it right. And I don't care what the argument is. I just want it to be a good one. And that's, again, why I relate to you, and because I see you do that too all the time. So when I do it and it happens to be a black student I'm doing it to, I see in the faces of my white students, sort of a look of fear that something's about to jump off in here because you're not supposed to do that. I don't know. I don't want to speak to what's in their minds because I don't know. That's what I'm guessing is happening in their minds. And I have certainly at times been nervous, especially in recent years, in the last few years, that the black student, I almost hate saying that, but the black student would not take kindly to it and maybe even call me a name or two. I don't know what they say after the class in their dorm rooms about it, but I do know that I have had many, many, many of them tell me that they love that and they're grateful for it because they never get that in their other classes. Yeah. Right?
I believe that.
I know you do. And I have seen this done to senior faculty at elite universities with 3 or 4 books written. Leaders in their field have the same experience. Walk through those halls, sit in those conference rooms, at those tables in those classrooms, and never have their ideas challenged. Because everyone, I'm assuming, is terrified of being called a racist. And I'm thinking, no, it's doing that looks a lot more like racism to me, because what you're doing is you're treating them like they're not intellectual, grown-up people like us.
I want to tell you a story. Jeffrey Stone is a former dean in the University of Chicago Law School. He's a legal scholar at Chicago. As a part of the Provost Lecture Series here on free speech on campus, he was brought out to give a lecture, and he's a free speech advocate on campuses. He's a law professor at the University of Chicago. During his speech, he told an anecdote. I'll be brief. The anecdote, basically, the punchline was, in a Socratic method law school lecture on free speech issues, the use of the N-word came up. And a professor, in citing a case in which the N-word had been used the word. Okay. Now, in recounting this anecdote, Jeffrey Stone himself used the word. Mm-hmm. He said the N-word. Mm-hmm. So he finishes his talk, which is a very nice talk. Mm-hmm. And an African-American woman, student, stands up after maybe the third question had been asked, and she says, "I take offense at your use of the N-word." To which Jeffrey Stone says, "Well, I tell you what, I was describing a case. If you like, there were inverted commas around my use of the N-word because I was using it to tell you someone else had used it." Mm-hmm. She persisted. He said, in effect, "You don't get to tell me whether or not I can quote somebody's use of a word. That's not your call." Mm-hmm. Okay, so thanks for your question, but would you please have a seat? Mm-hmm. I mean, he said it politely, but he said it very firmly. Then he found occasion to use the word twice more as he proceeded to deliver his lecture, and I think that second use might have been gratuitous. Afterwards, there was a lively discussion amongst our faculty. I liked what Jeffrey Stone did there. He confronted her, he didn't back off, and he said, "No, you don't get to tell me that." She was saying, "It felt bad to hear you use that word." Mm-hmm. He was saying, "I used it appropriately in the context. I regret that it made you feel bad, but guess what? You don't get to, that's not your call." Many of my colleagues, for weeks afterwards, were grousing about Jeffrey Stone coming here and disrespecting a student. Frankly, I thought it was exactly the opposite. Mm-hmm. I thought he was respecting her. Mm-hmm. Respecting her enough not to run away because she cried that she was offended, but to stand his ground, mm-hmm. because he was right, mm-hmm. about what his intentions were in enunciating those syllables on behalf of trying to convey substantively something that was of interest. He didn't have to jump through hoops in order to do that. This is, anyway, I go on too long just to try to make that point.
That's perfectly illustrative of what we're talking about. So you know what we do with children, right? We protect them from things that will hurt them. And for children, it's not just physical violence that hurts them, right? It's scenes of violence, ideas of violence, sex, ideas about sex, images. We protect them from those things. Is it not exactly the same dynamic there? We think that black people will be harmed by these words. And we are protecting them like we would children.
Yeah, okay, so there is that, and for some of my colleagues, I think that might have been a major motivation. I want also to say the student was making a power grab in that circumstance.
Oh, that's the interesting.
She was trying to define the situation and control it.
That's right, yeah.
Okay, and ceding that power to her, I mean, it might have a patronizing motive, but it has real consequences in terms of the allocation of discretion within a complex environment, and I don't know that that's I'm dubious about whether or not that's how I want to have an institution like this being run.
Students telling you what you can and cannot say.
Right.
Yeah. Right.
They're students, after all.
That seems difficult to sustain as an educational institution, right?
They're students.
Yeah.
After all.
Yeah. Yeah. And we should take their ideas seriously, but neither one of us in that relationship, I would say, should dictate what they can and cannot say. Is that fair? I mean, that's how you run your classroom.
That's where I'm going.
Yeah.
And there is an asymmetry. I mean, of course you have to respect them, and they are constituent elements of the community here, and their interests are wanting to be considered. But the reason this is a hierarchical relationship, pedagogically speaking. Yeah. Stanley Fish came here to Brown and gave what I thought was a very interesting talk about free speech in the university, in which the central thesis was, in a way, there is no such thing as free speech, and you don't have a right to say anything you want in the university. This is a hierarchical, meritocratic thing. So for example, there's peer review. You don't get tenure if you don't get published. And the people who decide on whether or not something gets published, I mean, it's not free speech. Not everybody's article gets to be in the journal. It's the ones that are judged by whatever. Now, you may have a criticism of that process, but the idea that it's going to be free speech, that you can say anything and there'll be no consequence to what you say, is absurd.
I mean, yes. Okay. But wouldn't you say that if an institution claims that it is committed to free inquiry,
yes,
the exchange of ideas,
yes,
the contest among and between ideas, if that is their stated mission,
yes,
it seems to me, to be consistent with that, they would not allow one person to dictate the language of another.
I would certainly say that.
And is that is, I think, the kind of institution you would like to teach in, is that right?
With respect to the use of a word like the N-word or whatever,
yeah.
Absolutely. But with respect to alternative narratives about American history, some of which are supported by carefully documented research into the evidence that's available, others of which are just spun off the top of somebody's head and never touched the ground. A tribunal somewhere that decides about the former, that's our stuff, goes in the journal, that guy gets tenure, or that woman gets tenure. And about the latter, that's fluff, and I'm sorry, you had your assistant professor contract, I wish you well. I think that's quite all right. I think that's what we do. I mean, there's no way to get around no judgment. Now, let me just say,
sure.
I'm an economist. If you're a Marxist, I mean, I'm a serious Marxist. I mean, a serious Marxist intellectual, okay, in the 21st century, rooted in the landmark foundational text of Marxism, but, a skillful economic analyst of a Marxist persuasion, good luck. Trying to get tenure in the economics department in America. I'm sorry. No application for Marxists. No Marxists need apply. Is kind of the thing. And I think that's a problem. That's all I want to say is,
you think it's a problem?
In the spirit of your observation just made about an openness to inquiry, I believe that's a problem. Yes, I do. I mean, I'm not a Marxist myself, doctrinaire or whatever, but I've read some penetrating and really interesting critiques that have come out of a Marxian intellectual frame, and I think it challenges us. And maybe not every department has to have a Marxist, but being a Marxist ought not to disqualify you, assuming that you're producing work of value that articulates with questions that are of importance to the discipline, ought not to disqualify you.
Yeah,
but effectively it does.
Yeah, I didn't know that. I didn't know that it was disqualifying among economists.
I don't know. I mean, what the American Economics Association would say in its official pronouncements.
No, of course not. That's not how these things work.
When the hiring committees get together, the reading committees and the whatnot.
Well, so what's funny is that that Marxist economist will do just fine in every other department in the humanities. And half the social sciences, right?
That's true.
Just fine. So the N-word, do you use that?
All the time.
You don't, I mean, which do you use? Do you say the N-word or do you say the actual word?
Oh, well, it depends on the context. In everyday speech, when I'm talking to people, especially black people, about what's going on, I mean, saying the niggas or this or that, I wouldn't even think about it.
Oh, no,
it wouldn't even be a question.
No, I don't mean like.
But for a podcast or something like that, I have said that. I just did it. I just said it. I have said the word. John McWhorter and I have had conversations on Blogging Heads where the word has come up, and one of the commentators wrote in the comment section in all caps, Glenn said the N-word, and then gave the 13 minute and 40 seconds into the thing when I said the N-word, and I didn't even think about it. What is this guy talking about? But I'm not afraid to use it, although I don't go out of my way to use it, and I am always self-conscious when using it that I'm kind of in a territory where if I weren't black, I'd never be able to get away with this.
Let me see if I can get away with it. So in my classrooms, until about 2012, 13, somewhere around there, I said nigger, and I said it, not as an epithet, not attributing anything to any one person or people, but I used it the way that the people I was talking about used it, meaning people in American history. So I have said that word, I have said that nigger might be the most important word in American history. It is certainly one of the most important words. It has meant a lot in many different contexts. I would say it has determined, or the meanings of it, the multiple meanings of it have determined much of American history.
What do you think of Randall Kennedy's book?
I think it's sadly neglected. That's the problem. I don't know what happened. When his book came out, we had a nice discussion. We're in a new era. I know you know this, but in the last 3 or 4 years, something has changed. So my point I was getting to was that I did it, and it was fine. I had no problem. I think because what my students are, they were grown-up intellectuals, and they knew what I was doing in there. Yeah. But even me, in the last few years, I have started to say the N-word in my classes, and I'm ashamed of it because it's cowardly.
It's just too much trouble.
It's not only cowardly, but as I was saying, it's treating them like children. This is ridiculous. I mean, especially, my God, when it's like people like us right here, 2 or 3 grown people sitting in a room together, we can't use the word among ourselves even when we know how we're using it. I mean, if we can't use that word, we can't talk seriously about anything, because that is an important word. The Huckleberry Finn controversy, right?
Yeah.
When they took the word out, that's my point here. So that work.
So did they, in fact, take the word out?
One publisher in the South did, which was interesting that it was a Southern publisher, I think in Alabama, Montgomery, I believe, in fact.
But if I were to go over to the library here and pull down Huck Finn, I'd find the
there's
word.
No. But one publisher did it, and then it was talked about. And
Interesting
thing about that, by the way, on 60 Minutes, there was a poet, David Bradley, I think is his name, African-American. I hate doing that, but I just have to because it's important in this context. They interviewed David Bradley, who was a poet. He was teaching at the University of Oregon, of all places, at that time. And they asked him what he thought about this. And he said, nigger? I love that word. And whoever the Morley Safer was, or whoever, said, what? How could that be? And he said, because to me, nigger means all the good stuff about my people. It means I'm proud of that. I'm proud of what niggers have done in this country, because we made this country interesting. We made this country fun. If there's any such thing as individual freedom around here, niggers have had a lot to do with that. So that's one of the main reasons.
Okay, so kind of like the use of queer or something, at least in the same family of sort of an embrace. What had been a stigmatizing and kind of meant to put you off, I embrace it, exactly, and all that comes along with it, of which I'm proud.
So when gay marriage became a thing as a movement in the 80s and 90s, there was a split-off movement, or an antagonistic movement among people who used to identify as gay, who said, we're not gay anymore, we're queer. And their whole criticism of the gay movement for gay marriage was that us homosexuals in 1969 and 70 and 71, we were the ones who in this country made sexual freedom possible. We were the ones who broke open closets, not just for gay people, but for everybody, because we redefined all these categories and said, you don't have to live within this particular box your whole life. And now you just want to put us right back in to that Ozzie and Harriet house in the 1950s with a picket fence and 4 walls and lots of closets.
Precisely.
So the same thing. So Glenn, my work I've done that. I've been interested in that. I've written about that. But I've been especially interested in the same question or issue or problem with African American history. So what I've seen is that the slaves had no idea or apparent care about this nuclear family concept, because of course that's a Northern European invention. If you go around the world even today, that's a rare thing. It's not a concept, and it's certainly not a moral category. So the slaves raised their children as a large extended family. Now, people have argued, well, that's because they could be sold away at any time, and maybe it was out of necessity. But the major point is that the slaves, as far as we know, and I'm not alone among historians in saying this, had no moral claims, made no moral claims about raising children with the aunt and the uncle and not just the mom and the dad. They made no moral claims, or their morality was at least much softer about things like adultery, about having multiple sexual partners, about having children with many people. And then, here you go, Glenn, let's say you have many children with many different people. There was just, historians have said, among the slaves, no apparent shaming of that. And so it was actually okay to
So what are we doing with Herbert Gutman? I mean, again, I'm not a historian, but I do know about the black family and slavery and freedom. And
so this is I'm attacking Gutman indirectly here.
I could see that, and I wonder why you would do such a thing.
Because I'm just a bad person.
You're disruptive.
I'm just a bad person. No, he was part of the movement to make Robin Kelly. I'm sure you know about him.
Yeah, I know about Robin G.D. Kelly. DG, I bet. GD. See, that betrays my anti-Marxist.
Yeah.
I meant to say, Robin, if you're listening, I meant to say DG. Yeah, I know. Everybody knows about Robin Kelly.
Robin, after his second book, has gone pretty hard Marxist, and that's when I left the train too. But
yeah, man,
his second book, Race Rebels, which is a collection of essays, this is exactly where that argument is. And that's when I read that, I was on the number 9 train going downtown from Columbia, and I was supposed to get off at 42nd Street to go to a meeting.
Kept on going to NYU.
And next thing I knew, I was in Brooklyn.
oh, I see. Oh, my Lord.
Because I couldn't believe what he was saying. Here's this historian, a black historian, saying, this was in 1995, I think, 96. He was saying, oh, yeah, black people have been, quote, bad, according to, in comparison to the white American standards, about things like family and work, he said, and sexuality since slavery. And you know what? And this is what Robin really did, which was revolutionary. He said, you know what? Maybe that stuff is actually better. Maybe dancing is actually not a bad thing. Maybe it's actually a good thing. Maybe it's better than what whites were saying at the time in the 19th century, which was that the only dance that was acceptable was the waltz, dancing in a square. So
no, I'm with you on the dance. I may not be with you on the family, only because I want to know about the functional consequences for child development of multiple paternity households, or of early unwed pregnancy. I'm not celebrating the nuclear family as some kind of iconic moral ideal. I'm just saying what works for raising kids. Now, you make reference to Africans and then slaves, and I want to say the world of those people is not the world we find ourselves in the atomized 21st century urban districts or whatever. If that supportive communal structure were there, I don't care if there's a marriage certificate and the mother has 1 or 2 or 3 lovers, but if those kids are not actually maturing into well-adjusted adults who are able to function in society, in part because the structure of nurturance for them available for them when they were coming along was not adequate, well, that would be a separate issue. So I would not throw the nuclear family out simply because it's normative. I mean, I heard Angela Davis was here at Brown last year giving a lecture. And she's Angela Davis, and she's worth hearing, okay? It was the first time I'd actually seen her lecture in person. They carried her into the auditorium practically on a throne chair. And the students were like bowing down as she completed and, whatever. And she said something like, amongst many things, she said, if it's normal, if it's normative, if somebody is telling you that this is the way we ought to do it, be transgressive of that, be against that. Okay, liberty and freedom is to be had in defying norm. Well, that was an incoherent statement to me. I mean, that's rebellion for its own sake.
Right.
without any relationship. Well, not all norms are corrupting or enslaving or whatever. And I just wonder what a world without any kind of normative constraint on human behavior would look like. Indeed, our very principles of justice rely upon us embracing certain kinds of norms or ideals about what we think right living is. And when I face problems of violence and things of this kind, I want, anyway, so I'm trying to push back a little bit.
No, that's good. Yeah, so I mean, I wonder what Angela Davis would say to the norm on college campuses concerning diversity. Should we just push back against it?
For example,
Should
that's
we
a good
just
example.
transgress
Right.
against this? So no, a lot of people confuse my work and my ideas with her statement on that and think that I'm advocating rebellion just for its own sake, and I am not. And if you read like the third page of my book, I make it very clear that if everybody just did that, we would live in chaos and anarchy, and it would be a hellscape. No, I don't love norms. I don't love moralizing, but I think rules often are good because we got to play some games, and you need rules to play games, and some games are important to play. But
Okay.
right? Does that make sense?
Well, that's right, but are some ways of life more edifying and whatnot? You talk to a guy who used to be a born-again Christian.
I know.
Oh.
So I was going to say, you just have an instrumentalist view of the family. Just does it work or not, right?
I guess I maybe I don't have a settled view after all. At the end of the day,
because the argument that you've made and many people have made, and I take it seriously. I don't think I agree with it, but I just don't know. Actually, is that one of the leading causes of all these black boys killing each other is that they don't have fathers.
Is absent fathers, indeed. Yeah.
And so
I can't prove it, but yeah, I believe it.
And no one can prove it. That's okay. I still take it seriously. I can't prove a lot of my stuff either. But, I think... So my thing in response to that is two things. One, well, what if they actually had many people raising them? That's one.
Okay.
And sometimes they do, by the way. I mean,
Yeah.
I can't even tell you how many black people, and especially men, both, men and women I've known who have said, oh, yeah, I was raised by, just like you. I was raised actually by my grandmother or my grandfather or both.
Well, that is my story.
Aunts
in the
and uncles
sense
and
that
cousins.
My mother brought her children to her sister's home, and I was raised with my cousins in that big, stable and secure household. African
Americans and immigrants until they assimilate. That's exactly what they do too, and that's one of the things they get criticized for, and that's one of the reasons has been used to exclude them, to close the borders. So one of the major arguments for the immigration restriction bills in the 1920s was that these goddamn Italians and Slavs are bringing these big old families over, and that's not how we do things here. Because America is about the man and the woman in the isolated home up on the hill raising those kids by themselves, the rugged individualism thing.
I see.
Yeah, but so you said that there was some criminals and some violence in your neighborhood in the 50s and early 60s in Chicago, but then things got a hell of a lot worse, right? Later? Well, we know this. We just know this statistically.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, the stuff that... There were numbers runners. There was pot sellers.
They don't hurt people,
there were people who were hijacking trucks and stuff like that and would come to my uncle who had some cash because he was running a business and try to sell him 30 suits. Right. That he could store in the back of his barbershop and sell them to his customers over the next couple of months. And, he paid $25 for a suit and he'd sell it for $75. Some units in 1968. So things like that. Mm-hmm. And there was my aunt and uncle in this big, beautiful house. They had some workmen come in and completely remodel the basement and put in a bar and lights and the flooring and whatnot in the basement, and they turned it into a juke joint. They would have Friday night sets, Saturday night sets. People would come and they'd be drinking down there, and they selling them the beer and they selling them the Canadian club or whatever they drinking, and the players would come. The high rollers. The people would be coming. They'd be there 3:00 in the morning. It was like an after party. And my aunt and uncle were small business people hustling. They were just basically trying to make money. The neighbors, of course, were worried about the cars pulling up at 2:00 in the morning and whatnot, and all the traffic back and forth. But hey, it's all good.
Was it all good?
Pretty much. Nobody was laying dead with a gunshot wound in the chest.
Is it all?
I mean, it was. There was drunkenness. There was, you know, what they call it, boy and girl, the heroin and the cocaine. It was around, and you know, a lot of people smoking weed, man. That was just like, it didn't even warrant a mention. And some of those high rollers were pimps and you know, whatever. I mean, you know, thieves, whatever. I mean, I don't know. I mean, in fact, my uncle, the one who took me up to Statesville to visit the his buddy, there was stuff he didn't want me to know. You know, I'd say, where did that come from? You don't want to know. Uncle Money, who you buy your marijuana from? You don't want to know. It was these Italian guys.
I told you about them.
Straight up. You know, he knew some people who were wired, and you know, he could.
This was in the 60s?
Yeah, 50s and 60s.
Yeah, right. That's what I study. I study those scenes underground like that. That fascinates me, and it's unstudied. But so you're there, you're seeing this, you're in those rooms.
Yeah, I was all the way up until I started my first year of college when I graduated high school when I was 16, and I had a little area down in the basement that I'd study. That was my like study area down there.
That's where I was going.
And I'd have to close it up to make room for the partying on Friday night, you know. So I'd have to move my table over into the corner and whatever. But
that's where I was going with this. So you were weird then. You're weird now in really good ways. You're weird then in a good way too. But so you, I think, probably the first guest on this podcast who was a good student. Yeah, in high school. All my guests, pretty much, including me, were terrible students. I was a C average student in high school. Most of the people I interview are people who became sort of intellectuals later or despite of school. But am I right that you were just
I was a good student. I was
like really good, right? Weren't you?
Yeah, I mean,
like straight A's.
Pretty much.
And math, you were
especially in math and science, but you know, also you know, took Latin and you know.
It's ridiculous. Yeah. I don't understand people who can get an A in a math class. I don't even know who you are.
We're good people over here, man.
But not only were you good at it, but you cared about it. That set you apart in two ways. Right?
Yeah.
And there you are with your study in the juke joint.
It was getting my study pushed to the side because I knew that the party was coming. It wasn't like I was studying amidst
I know.
classes.
You had to sacrifice your study for the juke joint.
Yeah, I had to. You know, I felt blessed that I could use the basement, you know, as a study area because it was one place in the house that was quiet.
On one level, one could say that describes your whole career, right? You're the academic who's you're studying serious things, so-called serious things, in a world of debauchery, and you're troubled, I guess, about the world of debauchery. I mean, it sounds like you think it was all fine then, but now you're not so fond of those kinds of scenes nowadays. Is that right? You think it's
so it's complicated, and I tried to get at this a little bit in the Love and Radio interview that you mentioned. That it's complicated because I think, and I'm now sitting here. The year's 2017. I'm 68 in a few weeks, 69 years old. But back in the 80s, when I was at Harvard and when I was emerging as a public intellectual, and I was writing essays and commentary magazine, The New Republic, under the Merton P editorship, Public Interest, these kind of neocon organs in that time. I was you know, lambasting the bad actors amongst African Americans and calling for cultural renewal or reform or something. And I'm saying all of that to say, at the same time, I was, you know, philandering, and I was getting high, and I was, you know, I was partying, and I was having a good time, and I was playing on the dark side. I was, you know, walking on the wild side, or whatever the right metaphor is here. I was not a shrinking violet, not in the least. And I'm saying all of that not to be confessional, but to point out that there was a real tension between the public and the private persona. And although this is self-psychoanalysis, I think there is merit in this particular observation I'm about to make, which is those things were not unrelated to one another. Okay? The fervor with which I would publicly call for righteous livings amongst African Americans was somehow the refraction of something that was going on internally, in which I was aware of my own foibles and proclivities to deviate from normality, and perhaps a bit of self-reproach involved in that. That then gets projected out onto the society. Do as I say, not as I do. God help me, but that I can't help doing this. But Lord knows the next time I get a chance to, I'm going to do it again. I know I'm going to do it again. Something like that. Jimmy Baldwin probably put it better than me at some point in his large corpus. But this is,
Oh yeah, when you were testifying to Congress, right?
Yeah.
On the culture of African Americans, you were testifying against yourself. In part.
Yeah. That's pretty clear in retrospect, isn't it?
Looks like it to me.
Yeah. I don't think there's any way around it.
Yeah. How many people, though, would be able to not only know that about themselves in retrospect, but be comfortable saying it in public in a microphone? I mean, that's, again, Glenn, you're pretty weird.
Well, you put your finger on it. I don't know if this was on the record or not earlier when you mentioned addiction recovery and the way in which, at least for me, maybe for you too, that has shaped not only my practice with respect to controlled substances and addiction. I don't do cocaine anymore. I used to do it. I used to enjoy doing it, but it was killing me. But also with respect to kind of life. I mean, the 12 steps are not I admit it. I accept it. I came to believe. I made a decision. I came to believe. These are not bad guideposts for just kind of getting through the maelstrom and the muck and mire of life. And for example, this relationship that I am blessed by with my sweetie, my fiance, Miss LaJuan Sadler of Houston, Texas. God, if I couldn't be honest with her about the stuff that was going on with me, I don't know that we would be where we are right now or have the prospects of where I hope we will get to. So I feel blessed to have had the revelation of the absolute indispensability of self-honesty. Now that's self-honesty. I don't have to broadcast it to the world. My sister, she reads my stuff. She said, she listened to the podcast thing on Love. She said, I can't believe you told all that stuff about yourself. I will go to my grave with those secrets. But what I have found is I really need to be unfettered in doing that in order to be healthy. If that sounds new agey, I can't help it. I'm in a better place than I used to be. I don't have to get high anymore.
Me too, on both scores. If you listen to this podcast, I have said a whole lot of stuff over the last 18, I guess, episodes now that shock me actually when I hear myself saying them, and often shock some people close to me, and sometimes ruffle some feathers too in my family. But I don't know. I feel like I need to do it, and I feel liberated because there's something about doing that further sort of shoves the shame away. When I was in AA, and I know you've talked about this, that was the most remarkable thing about it to me was all these people were saying these things to these groups of strangers that were just stunning, and they were doing it so comfortably. Someone said to me, the whole point here is to wear your sobriety like a comfortable sweater. And they were wearing their past crimes, because some of them were literally crimes, but many of them were crimes against themselves and against the people they loved. They were wearing them comfortably in front of a group of strangers. And when I heard your interview on that other podcast, that's what I heard. I immediately I could say, oh, this guy he's in recovery. He was in 12-step program. Because I've never heard, well, let me say this. I have definitely never heard a professor talk like that about their private lives. And I've certainly never heard a professor who also operates simultaneously on a very high intellectual level do it. So, I mean, yeah. So, I mean, you're the perfect guest for this. But anyway, I wanted to just back up a little bit, because I'm not sure I've ever heard this. You kind of skipped over a little piece there. 1 minute you're studying hard in the next to or you're folding up your study in the juke joint, and then the next minute you're a neocon in Washington, D.C. So how did you I know that you became a conservative and were courted by the Reagan administration and asked to be Assistant Secretary of Education?
I was asked to be Undersecretary.
Undersecretary.
That was the number 2 position in the department.
So you were a tremendous...
Gary Bauer had been my immediate predecessor in that position. This is the right-wing guy.
Notorious.
Bill Bennett was the secretary.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
My favorite.
So how did I get from the one to the other? So I dropped out of college after my first child was born. I dropped out of college. I started college in September of '65, and I dropped out the spring semester of '67. I had basically stopped going to class. I found a job at the printing plant that I mentioned, and my girlfriend and I eventually became husband and wife. We had another child. We became husband and wife. And we moved independently, and I was just working for about a year. This would be '67, '68. And then, but I'm a studious kid. I had talent. I knew I had talent. I was curious. And I decided I'd take a few classes at a community college, a junior college. The Southeast Junior College is what it was called, and was later renamed after 2 guys who got killed in Vietnam, and was called the Olive Harvey. One of them was black, the other was white. It was 2 young kids from the neighborhood who ended up losing their lives in Vietnam, and they named the college after them.
Were they drafted? Do you know? Do you know if they were drafted?
I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Anyway, although many people were, including the star quarterback of my high school graduating class, who ended up losing his left leg over there, and including my sister's first husband, who went off a brilliant, dynamic, charismatic young man. He had made the 101st Airborne. He was going to jump out of airplanes and stuff like that, and he came back shell-shocked, shadow of himself. In just 3 years, I mean, the same guy. 2 or 3 years, he was and he never recovered from it. Other people had other experiences. But anyway, this was a community college. I decided to enroll and take some classes there. One of them was a calculus class. It was taught by a man, an engineer who had retired from industry and was teaching community college calculus. He was an alumnus of Northwestern University's School of Engineering. And at a community college on the south side of Chicago, he was in touch with the admissions department at Northwestern to help recruit potentially promising talent. This was 1969, 1970. And they wanted to bring some black kids into Northwestern who might have a chance of being able to cut it. And he saw that I was a crackerjack at, doing this, integrating these functions, trigonometric substitutions, the stuff that you can't understand.
I don't even know what you're talking about.
Gets an A at it. Yeah, well, I was good at that stuff. And so he commended me, and they took me in. They gave me a full scholarship. But I still had a wife and 2 kids. So I still had a full-time job. But I figured this is a chance of a lifetime. Let me go over to Northwestern, and I enrolled as a transfer student in the fall of 1970. And I graduated after. They were a quarter system, so there were 3 quarters of the 70-71 and 3 quarters of the 71-72 academic years, and the summer in between. And in that period, I took 27 courses. I got 24 A's and 3 B's. I took the graduate first-year microeconomic theory course from Northwestern's economics department. I took the graduate first-year mathematics analysis course from Northwestern's mathematics department. I did these things in my senior year. I just tore the place up. I was just on this very fast, wife and 2 kids at home, sleeping 4 or 5 hours a night, working 40 hours a week. And if I could get the overtime, I took it because I could use it. But I had these guys, the foreman at the printing plant where I was a clerk, working the night shift, midnight to 8 a.m. Took a liking to me. I've always had a book under my arm. I was always there. I was reliable. I did a good job. I didn't go to the bathroom for 2 hours for a break, stuff like that. And the next thing I knew, the guy was saying, "Okay, you got all your work done. You can go in my office." Because the printing plant, the presses were running. The hand trucks were going to, it was nonstop. 24-hour a day, the operation there. I was working the midnight shift, but the foreman told me I could go in his office and study as long as I had my work done. He would protect me. If my guy comes looking for me, he would tell him that he sent me on an errand, because the supervisor for me was not the foreman. The foreman was the shop floor guy, but I'm a clerk. So there was a clerk supervisory thing that had, many departments under its purview. And I got to know these guys. They're all guys. Italian, Polish, Irish, Jewish. There were very few Latinos and very, very few blacks, who were the craftsmen, the assistant pressman, the roll tender, the ink person who took care of the ink for the printing press and whatnot. They were all ethnic union guys who were, but they adopted me. I was a kind of a mascot. This kid's going somewhere. This kid's, he's at Northwestern. He's, and I bring the book. They look at the book. Say, makes my head hurt looking at your book, man. Go in the office and study. You study. Make something of yourself. I like it. I like that you're taking care of your kids. I like that you're working. Behind his back, he's saying, not like those other niggers in the blah, blah, But that was my world. 1970, 71, 72. And I got discovered by some teachers there at Northwestern who could see that I was an exceptional talent. And before too long, being told that you should go to graduate school. I hope you will go to graduate school in economics. I was thinking about mathematics. That was my major. But I came to realize that as good as I was doing, I was not really a talented mathematician the way that some people are. I took, they call it the Putnam Exam, and it's an exam, a competitive exam in mathematics for undergraduates in college that's given every year. 10 questions. Bunch of talented kids take it, and the one who gets the most questions right is the winner if there's a tie. And the questions are very, very hard. They're not like the formulaic problems that I was used to solving where I have to be clever and invent some, formula and then, whatever. They were all like, you have to make up your own framework in order to be able to get at this kind of problems. The median number of correct answers, that is, half or more of the people get this number or fewer correct answers, 0. Most people don't get a single one correct. Okay. The winner, the year that I took it, and one of my math teachers said, I want you to come to my office every week. We're going to spend 45 minutes at the blackboard. You're going to be solving problems. This is training for you to take the Putnam Exam. I know you can do well. The year I took it, the guy that won had 6 correct answers out of the 10. I could not answer a single one of those questions. And I thought, I'm going to go to graduate school in mathematics and then be a mediocre mathematician? I'd rather be a historian.
The easy stuff.
Or an economist. And so I switched over to economics. But in any case, based on a strong record, my GRE scores were what they were. And I was.
What were they?
Like 780 on the quant and 690 on the verbal, something like that.
780 on the quant out of 800.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It was. And so I ended up getting admitted to MIT. And Ford Foundation gave me a full scholarship. I moved my young family to Cambridge, Massachusetts. Our marriage did not survive the 4 years of graduate school. We split up and later divorced, and I ended up remarrying to Linda, the late Linda Datcher Loury, Dr. Loury, who was my was co-student in the economics program at MIT. She finished her PhD 2 years after me. We ended up marrying. But so the way I come to be a professor is through this avenue of being discovered by a teacher in junior college, directed to Northwestern University, where I got a tremendous education for free. It was affirmative action. I don't think there's any way around that. I was a black kid. They saw I could potentially do the work, but my record was checkered. I had dropped out of college previously and transferring from a community college. But my test scores were high, and I was not a bad bet if you were trying to make a bet on, can we bring some kids from Southside Chicago to Northwestern? I got an education there, got to MIT, which was the best economics department in the world at that time. Paul Samuelson, Robert Solow, Peter Diamond. Franco Modigliani, Robert Merton. All these people have Nobel Prizes now, and they were in the prime of their, or toward the latter part of their careers at the time that I was there as a student. It was a tremendous place. So I got a great education at Northwestern and MIT, and I found myself as an academic economist, pretty much a theoretical economist doing mathematical modeling. But my first job was at Northwestern University, but the woman who became my wife was at the University of Michigan. And so I moved so we could be together. The woman, my second wife, Linda. And when I moved to Michigan, and we were going to Detroit a lot. Michigan was a labor left bastion.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, the UAWs, they were very, very ideologically pro-labor.
Oh, yeah.
And I was looking around at the steel industry, the auto industry, the rubber industry, and I'm saying, man, the world is changing. I didn't know the word globalization at that time, but I did know the process that was going on. You're competing against labor that's cheaper. You're going to keep the Japanese cars out. We're not going to buy any German or Swedish cars. We're going to just keep them all out. That's you sticking your head in the sand. And I'm saying, you guys are pricing yourselves out of the market, and you're so inflexible and ideological, and there needs to be some flexibility here and whatnot. And I just found myself less sympathetic to the labor left atmosphere. And then if you started talking about the Negroes, about the black folk, I'm talking about Detroit. This is Detroit, 1978, 79, 1980.
Oh, my.
And John Conyers is up in Congress representing his district in the city, and he's a labor left liberal guy. I mean, there's nothing wrong with John Conyers but I just wasn't buying it. I was thinking the civil rights movement is over. I was thinking these people are grinding the same old axe. I mean, Conyers wanted to hold hearings in the Judiciary Committee on Police Brutality. He was a subcommittee chair. He had some influence over there. And I'm saying, well, what about we would call it today black on black crime? What about the disorder and violence in this? I get it, police brutality. So I had an evolving critique of the conventional or established civil rights mentality going. I didn't consider myself a conservative or a neoconservative or anything. I considered myself just a black guy and therefore necessarily a Democrat of some stripe. And a guy who wanted to be on the right side of the justice and civil rights issues, but who was not happy with the conventional wisdom amongst my peers, either on the economics of the labor stuff or on the kind of public policy issues about poverty, crime, work, family, things like this in the black community. So this iconoclasm, this kind of being against the current a little bit amongst African Americans brought me to the attention of people, the liberals who had been mugged by reality, the Nathan Glazers and the Irving Kristals and the James Q. Wilsons and the Aaron Wildofskis. I don't know if these names mean anything, but these were all in the 1970s and 80s, very substantial figures in public policy analysis. They founded a magazine called The Public Interest, and they did their critique of, John Lindsay, former mayor of New York City, liberalism. The cities are all going to hell in a handbasket because we won't stand up for either its law and order or traditional family or whatever. And I came to the attention of some of these neoconservatives who kind of brought me under their wing. I can remember this is now the early 1980s. I'm still a high-flying economist, a young economist. I get an offer of a job at Harvard. I come to Cambridge from the University of Michigan, and with my wife Linda. And now I'm starting to meet some of these people. Richard Herrnstein of the Bell Curve fame, who was a friend, Harvey Mansfield, who's a kind of notorious libertarian-esque, although no, I'm not quite sure how to define Harvey, and I don't want to do him injustice. He's a very interesting old school conservative kind of guy. I mean, maybe he's Burkean. Maybe he's like
real old school.
Yeah, he's real old. He talks about manliness.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Harvey's got a book on manliness.
All right.
Harvey has an essay called The Underhandedness of Affirmative Action. Harvey became famous for suggesting that one source of grade inflation was the fact that places like Harvard were admitting a lot of underqualified students of color, and then the professors didn't have the courage of actually giving them honest feedback on their work. He's not obviously wrong about that, okay? That's, but believe me, a ton of bricks fell. Anyway, I was meeting all these people, and I can remember Marty Peretz, who owned the New Republic magazine. He owned the New Republic, okay? And I get invited to his house for dinner, and here is this South African intellectual. This is before apartheid is done with. This is the early 1980s, and who's in from Johannesburg. And I'm looking at the art on the walls, and there's like masterpieces. I don't know what they are, but they damn sure look like they belong in a museum. And this guy, this is a rich guy, and he said, "Come on, write for our magazine. Come on, and come into the fold." Commentary, magazine, Norman Podhoretz, when you said you used to get beat up in the mixed neighborhood that you were, I was thinking about My Negro Problem and Ours, which was his classic essay of Podhoretz's.
I think that essay is the origin of the Iraq War. I think.
What kind of... Okay, now you're going to have to connect. This is a kid growing up in Brooklyn who gets beat up by the black boys on his way home, and he's got a Negro problem. And the problem is he's afraid of those black boys beating him up when he comes home and whatnot. How does that get us to the Iraq War?
Well, his communist parents had convinced him, like all that generation, that blacks were our allies, our historical allies. And
the struggle.
We were enslaved and they were enslaved, and now we're communists, and we are leading helping the civil rights movement. And then Norman's walking home one day from school, and he gets beaten up by black kids and also Puerto Rican kids, I think. And it happens again and again and again. By the way, it sounds a lot like my childhood.
Yeah.
And he writes, hey, wait a minute, maybe this alliance isn't so natural. Maybe we should, as Jews, go our own way. And then he moves very quickly toward an embrace of Israel, of course, which is the place where we will be protected, right, from people like, see where I'm going? Black
I see
people.
where you're going.
And then, next thing we know, the problem with Israel is that it's surrounded by all these Arabs who want to kill us, and we have to make sure the United States supports Israel so that Jewish people can be safe, unlike me in Brooklyn. And that's the origin of neoconservatism.
Okay, I think I get the broad outlines of the argument. I'm not endorsing it, but I can see it's worth taking it seriously. But I knew these. I'm saying I knew.
Yeah,
Midge Decter and Norman Podhoretz, Elliot Abrams, their son-in-law. I was at a dinner at their house one night, my wife and I, and Elliot Abrams and their daughter, his wife, whose name I don't recall, were present with the Podhoretzes in New York City circa 1986, something like that.
I'm dying to know. I don't know anything. What were the Podhoretzes like?
I think impressive, driven. Midge was smarter than Norm. Norman was very insecure. He would have to tell you, I've written more than 1 million published words in my life and things like that. Midge Decter, I stepped out on my wife, and I had a young thing that I was having a fling with, and I brought her to some event. She was in the audience, but it was really pretty obvious from the body language and stuff like that she wasn't just in the audience. She was with me. And I can remember Midge taking me aside and wagging her finger in my face about that. And I was impressed by that. Tactical people, they were at war intellectually, and knew it. So you were with us or against us, kind of thing like that. Widely read and thoughtful, though, as I say, I was much more impressed with Midge Decter's mind than I was with Norman Podhoretz's mind, and that may be unfair to him, but I didn't find him to be as deep and profound a person as I did his wife, who was harder to pigeonhole, and but she was working at a lower profile. But yeah, all this Committee for the Free World or whatever it was, I can't remember what they all call it now. I remember Gene Kirkpatrick and Scoop Jackson being heroes of these folks, because these.
I mean, this is the founding group of neoconservatism. these are the people at the very top.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there you are.
So I was there, and I was okay. I was the house Negro of that group, or I was,
Wait a minute.
call me what you will. I mean, I was the one who, when Daniel Patrick Moynihan comes out with the Godkin lectures that get published as a book called Family and Nation in 1985. He's a senator now, and he's Moynihan of the Moynihan Report on the Negro family from the 1960s, and he was pilloried for that because of just blaming the victim and whatnot. And he's got this kind of truth teller status or whatever. And he writes this book, which is, and Charles Murray's Losing Ground has just come out. And this is the attack on the Great Society as undermining poor people by taking the incentive for self-reliance away from them through transfer programs. This is Charles Murray. And Pat Moynihan is trying to counter that. Okay? And he produces this book, Family and Nation, which is about welfare. Murray is calling for the abolition of welfare.
Right.
Cold turkey, just cut it off, sending checks to people.
Right.
And Pat Moynihan is trying to counter that. And when it was necessary to get a hit person to write the review for Commentary Magazine of Moynihan's book, I got assigned that book. Okay. And I liked Pat Moynihan. He was a friend of mine, not an intimate, but someone that we would, Irish guy, liked to drink, liked a good joke. I don't think he turned too many pretty skirts away either, but, we got along.
Uh-huh.
But I wrote a very respectful but quite sharply critical review of Moynihan. I said, this is the same Moynihan who in the 1960s was telling us about the family. Now he's telling us that the nanny state can take the I think his loyalty to the Democratic Party is greater than his, in so many words. This was the tone of my review. When Jesse Jackson, after the firing of Andrew Young, and this was Jimmy Carter's administration, and then Jesse Jackson went over to Palestine and embraced Yasser Arafat, and some other civil rights leaders went to Libya and then kind of embraced Muammar Gaddafi.
See what I mean about Norm's problems with the blacks, where it leads?
Right, yeah, I see what you mean. These people are off the reservation, so to speak. And then Jackson decides he's going to run for president. And Louis Farrakhan decides that he's going to speak up about Jesse Jackson's running for president. And Norman Podhoretz and company are pulling their hair out because this is straight up anti-Semitism. The folks are off the reservation. They're talking all this crazy talk. They're hugging the wrong people. Don't they know what the Jews did for the civil rights movement? How could they be doing this? And it was time for someone to write about the blacks and the Jews. I got the assignment. Okay. So my essay about the blacks and the Jews won the, I can't remember this guy. Rickauer is the last name. I want to say Hyman Rickauer Award for Excellence in Jewish Journalism. Glenn Loury, black kid from the south side of Chicago, is one of the recipients of an endowed award for excellence in Jewish journalism based on an essay that I published in Commentary criticizing Jesse Jackson and company for going over to embrace the mortal enemy of the state of Israel.
Did you make broader claims about the relationship between blacks and Jews?
I did. I talked about shopkeepers and changing neighborhoods and residential segregation and whatnot. I talked about affirmative action. And it was a clash of visions argument. I said, the alliance is over. That this is the same thing that Norman had said 25 years earlier. I was, in a way, echoing, in a way, that argument. I was saying the alliance is over. First of all, the way that African Americans are going to react to claims about meritocracy is going to be very different than the way Jews are going to react. Blacks, Ocean Hill, Brownsville, the whole big controversy about teachers and schools and whatnot in New York City. The big debate about affirmative action. I was friendly with Nat Glazer. He had published this book, Affirmative Discrimination, in which he criticized affirmative action, and that was thought to be blasphemous, on the left, or at least on the civil rights left. I was friends with Abigail Thernstrom, who was writing about voting rights. Her book, Whose Votes Count, was critical of the dispensation that we still live under of the majority-minority district drawing in order to make sure that black people are represented by black electors, congressmen and whatnot, and she was critical of that. And I knew these people. I knew these people very well. They were personal friends of mine.
So I'm sure you were called a house Negro, but
yeah, I did. How did Martin Kilson put it? Martin Kilson, African-American political scientist at Harvard, who might have been, he certainly was the first political scientist to have tenure at Harvard, and he might have been the first African-American to have tenure in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Harvard. And he was a critic of black studies. He was already there with tenure before 1969, 1970 came, and all of the student protests, and then the instantiation of the black studies thing. And Martin Kilson was a lefty, had a historical orientation, knew a lot about the black societies, about the Masons and stuff like that, and the fraternal organizations and whatnot, going all the way back to the 19th century. He knew a lot about it, but he's a political scientist. But in any case, he called me a pathetic black mascot of the right. So it wasn't just like house Negro. It was like pathetic black.
It's going a little further.
Mascot. Yeah, it was like minstrel show, coon show on the right.
So you described yourself as a house Negro at one point. I mean, how did you feel? Did you feel that way, or do you feel that way now? Do you feel like you were used? Or
in retrospect, I may have been used, but I didn't mind. If it feels this good being used, just keep on using me until you use me up. I think that's Bill Withers, man. I was getting paid.
Yeah.
Okay. I was getting on the magazine cover. I was getting lecture invitations. I was in Time magazine and Newsweek as an intellectual avant-garde amongst black people breaking through and whatnot. And I was getting invited to places I had never been invited before, including the White House, state dinner. Ronald Reagan is president. My neocon buddy Bill Kristol is the chief of staff of the vice president of the United States, Dan Quayle. No, so maybe this is George W. Bush.
Yeah, it's W.
George H.W. Bush, who's so I'm getting my epochs mixed up. But the state dinner, Reagan is president, and I'm seated at the president's table at a state dinner in honor of the prime minister or president of Pakistan. It was unbelievable. So, no, I didn't mind being used. But, yeah, in retrospect, it's pretty clear that I was. They wouldn't have said they were using me. They would have said I had an important voice that they wanted to get out. I had something to say. It happened, of course, that it furthered the things that they wanted to hear being said. But I was a up-and-coming writer. I got spaces in their pages, more or less on the merits. Of course, I was one of the very few black people who would say anything like that. So.
But did you believe what you were writing?
Yes.
There you go. I mean,
I believed what I was writing.
Did all the money and the adulation and the state dinners shape your intellect?
I actually would like to say no. I can't be absolutely sure about that. I mean, do I shade here or there? I mean, I actually talked about this to a certain degree as I matured in this role. And when we get into the 90s and I start changing my mind a little bit and shifting, and I'm reflecting back on it, and I realized that that there was a certain kind of performance that was expected of me, which I gave uncritically, without being self-aware. And as I became aware of it, I started to get a somewhat of an ironical kind of relationship to it, because I was aware that I was doing it. And I said, I know you all have me in here today in order to hear a black person say something that you know is true, that I know is true, but that you dare not say. I know that's my role. Now let's think about that for a moment. I would kind of say to them, that was like late Glenn Loury, late in my neocon persona. I was kind of conscious of the position that I was in and the role that I was playing in it, and didn't reject it straight out, but became kind of, a little bit, as I say, ironic about it, a little bit of a sense of, isn't that interesting that I'm playing this
Well,
role?
Let me ask you this. Did they treat you like a man?
Yeah, actually. Yeah. I mean, when Midge took me aside and said, no, I think she was taking me pretty seriously. I don't have any reason to complain about how I was being treated. I mean, I do have now in my more centrist guys, or at least not quite explicitly neoconservative, the temptation to recount that period as one where I now become aware of the fact that these bad people were using me is great, because that really goes with the narrative, and it earns me kudos from a certain audience. But I think it would be unfair to them.
It earns you kudos from the people you work with.
Yeah.
The people surrounding us right now.
Yeah. In this university, it certainly does. That's what's expected of me. But I think it would be unfair to my former neoconservative colleagues to say of them that I was just a pawn, or somebody that they didn't take seriously as a person or whatever.
But it's also patronizing. Because if you believed what you were saying at the time, if it was sincere, then it's treating you as if you were a toy or a child.
Actually, to be honest with you, I sometimes think I let them down more so than the other way around. I mean...
Well, you turned on them.
I turned on them. Yeah. I turned on them.
Yeah. That's what a grown-up does. I mean, that's what a person with an independent intellect does.
That is, we're way beyond the time limit, and we gotta wind it up.
Okay, we will do it right now. Cocaine.
Oh Lord.
So
we could talk about that for a while.
Real quickly. So you were asked to be the Undersecretary of Education by Ronald Reagan, or his.
I was.
Yeah, and you were doing cocaine.
I wasn't really doing cocaine. I was smoking weed.
Okay.
The cocaine came after and is embedded within the depression that comes when my whole world falls apart. What I was doing was visiting with regularity and delight this 23-year-old Smith College graduate who I had set up in a penthouse apartment in the south end of Boston. Even though my wife, this is before our children were born, with my second wife, Linda, was sitting at home waiting for me to come home. And we smoked weed together, and we had sex together, and we traveled together and things like that. And I was having a good time in my relationship with this person. But it all blew up, and we had a fight one night, and she accused me of assaulting her. I was arrested by the Boston Constabulary and had to appear in court. I was charged with a felony offense, assault with a deadly weapon, to wit my shod foot, because this woman had alleged that I had kicked her. I didn't stomp on her. I didn't kick her, etc. I still have to say this 30 years after the fact, but I didn't. Anyway, bottom line is, while charges were dropped and whatever, that ended my prospects of a public career. So I ended up withdrawing from that appointment because of the scandal attendant to the extramarital affair and the assault accusation. Now, I was smoking weed all along, and I wasn't telling the FBI when they came to do the interview that I was smoking weed, and I don't know if they knew or they didn't know. But it was in the aftermath of having to be forced out of that appointment and being humiliated and being called a hypocrite. You see there, he's telling black people how to live. He's keeping a mistress and he's beating her up. I had to be told by my old friends back at MIT when I got a sabbatical leave from Harvard that I was not welcome to come as a lecturer, because they didn't want to put me in front of women in the class because I was a wife beater or girlfriend beater, which I was not. But again, you have to say this, it's 30 years on, whatever. Charges were dropped, blah, blah. Anyway, and I was out cruising one night after this, and I picked up this person, and I thought we were going to have sex, and she said, "You want to get high?" I said, "I don't mind getting high. What'd you have in mind?" She said, "Well, hold on, just wait a minute. Let me go around the corner. Give me $50. I gave her $50. She come back with some crystallized cocaine and a makeshift pipe. I took a couple hits on that bad boy. I'm telling you, it was all right. It was good, man. I liked the way it felt.
Cocaine feels great. People won't admit that. We don't talk about these drugs in that way. That's the truest way, which is that people do them because they make you feel really good. And cocaine,
at least for the,
I know
at
for
the beginning. After a while, when you have to go, from to your ATM to the thing, and you can't really get high the way you used to get high and whatnot, and it's 3 a.m. and
I'm not saying
that's a nightmare, man.
I'm not saying there's no problems attached to it. I'm just saying it feels good, and that's why we do it. But,
yeah, that's correct.
So there's the black conservative who's testifying before Congress and writing all these articles about how black people need to shape up, pull up their pants, work harder. stay at home with their wives, not do drugs. God damn.
And then I'm out there, and eventually I find out I don't need this woman to get the rock, and I start just kind of freelancing. I get to know these Dominican guys who are,
how were you rationalizing this massive contradiction in your life at the time? How were you comprehending what you were doing? Living the contradiction.
I'm just living, okay? I'm Superman. Okay, I mean, I can walk and chew bubble gum at the same time. I can do the lecture at the theory workshop, and I can come over to the street corner. I can talk to these guys at the housing project. I know a hoe when I see her on the street. I know if it's okay to go into the crack house. I know what's going on. I'm Glenn Loury. I'm Glenn fucking Loury. Mm-hmm. My attitude was, these guys, like, these black people at Harvard running around talking about being black, they don't know nothing about being black. Now, I, in reflection, don't want to identify blackness with whores, drugs, and carousing. But in my mind, as a matter of fact, the real, authentic, gut bucket, street level blackness, and these effete, soft, couldn't last 10 minutes in any place where it was real danger and they needed to know what was up in order to survive. They weren't as black as I was. I was from Chicago, from the South Side. Yeah, I had a PhD from MIT. Yeah, I could be the smartest person in the room. But you know what else? I know how to talk my way into and out of and et cetera. And I was proud of it. I was living.
So you were attracted to that blackness.
Yeah. That's what I'm saying. I'm saying the Italian thing and the German thing. And
yeah. I'm proud of being a nigger. Right? Kind of like David Bradley.
You said it, I didn't, but yeah.
No, well that's what.
Yeah, no,
that's what saying.
That's what he's saying, and that's
right.
how I felt.
So
yes.
This was a source of pride. One thing, that's one thing about it, right?
Yes.
And secondly, I would imagine it was also a lot of fun.
Damn right.
Yeah, there you go. So the problem is,
but it was wrong.
That's right. It was un-American, Glenn. And Ronald Reagan doesn't play that, and so that was it. But it's just amazing.
Can I just say something?
Yeah.
So 2 years on, and I've gone through rehab, and I'm back in my perch at Harvard, and I'm on the publication committee of the public interest, and they're having their at the Hay Adams Hotel in D.C. near the White House. They're having their semi-annual board meeting. I'm on the publication committee, so I'm there. Bill Bennett is the secretary he was the drug czar under Reagan. No, he's Secretary of Education under Reagan. He's the drug czar under George Herbert Walker Bush. He's there. Man, that cat was tossing back the tumblers of scotch like it was nothing. I mean, I don't know how many I watched him drink, okay? I'm sitting there like, white knuckle sobriety, because I'm clean and sober. I haven't had a drink. I don't do beer. I don't do wine. I damn sure don't do cocaine. And I'm sitting there like, and I want to drink. I mean, why not? I mean, we're at it was cocaine was my problem, not alcohol. I actually want to drink, but I know I don't do that anymore. I don't drink. This is a drug czar. Okay, so you say Ronald Reagan.
It's not a drug.
You say Ronald Reagan rectitude, and I'm saying, yeah, but
it's not a drug. What are you talking about? Alcohol's not a drug. It's good for you, unlike cocaine. White people drink. You know who does the drugs. Let's do policy, and then we'll finish.
Okay.
Okay, because I want to fix all this. The 700 black boys dead, right? Like, you said, I think it was on Facebook. Maybe it was last year. This was you yelling again, but in a beautiful way. Once again, I'm tired of all what Black Lives Matter is saying or not saying, and what Obama is not saying. I just want to fix it. So I'm pretty sure there weren't 700 black bodies on the streets of Chicago on the South Side where you were living when you were 10 years old.
No, there weren't. Although by the time you get to the 90s, and I'm no longer living there, that's 25 years after I am in high school.
Yeah,
that number has gone way up.
Right.
I mean, way up.
So how do you, as an economist, as a social scientist, explain that?
I think there's a lot of different. There's deindustrialization and the jobs and stuff. There's the gangs and the gang culture and stuff. There is the flight of the middle class from those residential communities, and so the composition of the communities changes. There is the drug trafficking and the violence that accompanies it, which feeds into the gang thing. I think Bill Wilson, the sociologist, has written about this. William Julius Wilson at Harvard, the sociologist.
Has he written about the connection between illicit drugs and violence?
No, he's written about the macro sociologic transformation, including the decentralization of metropolitan areas with economic activity going, including the deindustrialization with a lot of the jobs going offshore. That
I know that. I know he's done that.
Closing of steel mills and things like that.
I know he's done
that.
No,
he hasn't done much on the drug thing, but I'm calling attention to that. I think that's a part of it.
Yeah.
So the South Side has changed. I mean, when I was growing up on the South Side of Chicago in the 1950s and the 1960s, the black community was bounded on the south by like 95th Street or Roseland or whatever, and it was white beyond. It was bounded on the west by like, I don't know, Western Avenue or something, and then beyond that would have been ethnic, more Polish or Irish or something. It was and everybody was in there. Everybody, including the drag queens and the lawyers and doctors and ministers and school teachers and whatnot, along with the hustlers and the pimps and the whatever. There's been a lot of decentralization of the African American population in the greater Chicago area now. And the neighborhood that I grew up in, which is now a much rougher and less prosperous neighborhood, and people who were comparable now to where my family was back then, 50 years ago, are living in the south suburbs of Chicago. They're not actually living in the city proper. So there's been, I think, a kind of hollowing out. Mm-hmm. But I don't know that there's one answer to what has happened, or that even if I could give a coherent historical account of what has happened, that would tell us what to do about what's going on right now. So, for example, I think if you could get fewer guns in the hands of people, that would be a very, very good thing. I don't regard that as simply an edict. We're going to outlaw guns, because I understand that people are going to get access to them. But guns, I think, and that goes to, these are issues that are being debated in policy. So suppose I catch somebody with a gun. Should I incapacitate them, or should there be real serious consequences for that? Do I want to deter people? Suppose I think that if I can look in people's pockets with relative impunity, I'll discourage people from carrying guns because they don't want to get arrested for having a gun in their pocket, and they can't know for sure if I'm going to look or not. Well, now I'm into the stop and frisk kind of business, into the pretext policing kind of business where your tail light was out, and so I just want to know what's in their back seat. I want to get my flashlight in there because I might see the piece, and then I can get the piece off the street. I mean, I'm a guy who has spent years arguing against the over-incarceration and the excessive punitiveness of the American criminal justice system.
You may have been the first to really analyze that.
Thank you for noticing.
Am I right?
That was certainly before Michelle Alexander. I gave the Tanner Lectures at Stanford in 2007. Michelle's book doesn't come out until 2009 or 10, I think. And I made a big deal. And my buddy Loic Vacantes, he's a sociologist at Berkeley, a left-wing guy, French theorist, was a protege of Pierre Bourdieu. This is Loic Vacantes. And has worked a lot on prisons and stuff. He's a MacArthur Prize winner, Loic is, and he's a really first-rate Parisian theoretician. Flew overnight from Paris to get to Stanford so that he could comment on my lecture, and explained that the reason that he was going without sleep for 2 days was that he was so happy that an African-American intellectual was using the prestige of the Tanner Lectures on Human Values at Stanford to address himself in a vigorous, critical way to the mass incarceration, industrial complex kind of thing, and which is what I was doing in those lectures in 2007. So yes, but I'm saying all that by way of saying, if you told me that we could get some of those guns out of the hands of some of these guys by tougher law enforcement or by more intrusive policing, I'm prepared to listen to it. When Ray Kelly, who was then the commissioner of police in New York City under Bloomberg, came up here to give a lecture, and he was shouted down by students and townspeople as a racist. I was appalled at that, not because I endorsed Kelly or his policies, but because I wasn't sure whether I was going to endorse Kelly or his policies. And I wanted to hear from Kelly. I wanted to confront him with the questions about, you're ousting people, you're intruding on people and whatnot like that. And I wanted to hear what he had to say about it, because I don't think maintaining order in a city of 3 million or 8 million people is an easy problem. I think it's a difficult problem. And I don't think that simply throwing around the word racism at people who are trying to intervene in a way. I mean, the murder rate in New York City has gone from, 25 years ago, it was, you were killing 2,500 people in a year were being murdered in New York City. It's down to like 380. Now, most of those are black and Hispanic people who didn't get killed because of that decline in the murder rate. Presumably, policing has something to do with it, as well as emergency room medicine having something to do with it, and whatever else is going on. How can you talk about this problem without talking about that aspect of it? The aspect of it is that the people who suffer the worst consequences from antisocial behavior, and firing a gun out of a window without knowing where the bullet is going in a crowded urban area is antisocial behavior. It's contemptible behavior. It must be marginalized. Now, the duly instituted institutions of order maintenance in the society have a role to play. We can talk about accountability for those people, about the training of those people, about the whatever, but the idea that they are the enemy. So I maybe I'm trying to say too much in one burst, but I'm open to thinking carefully and deeply about what kinds of. I mean, I don't like this pie in the sky stuff. If we just had more money for the schools, we wouldn't have this violence. Well, that's pushing on a string. That's a pretty indirect causal change that's going to get. I mean, maybe we should have more money for the school, period. But to think that that's an answer to the 700 bodies laying on the street, I really got my doubts about that.
Well, we've had more money for the schools. If you look at spending on schools in this country since 1970, it has gone straight up.
Yes, hasn't it?
It's a spike. And look what the death rate's done, too, during that time. Let me put forward a couple of ideas, and I'm dying to know, and then you can have the last word in response to this, what you think about this. One, African Americans, history of enslavement and segregation, and being told that they do not belong in this society. I know that's not happening now. I'm talking about pre-1960. Redlining, all that story.
Yeah.
But it's a separation, not just from the rights, the legal rights that are accorded to full citizens, but it's also being told that culturally you are different. And you can never even be like us. And so among African Americans, and this is what Robin Kelly's work sort of turned me toward, is this attitude, especially among working class African Americans and those who are not the ministers of churches necessarily, except for Prophet Jones's people, but is this attitude of, well, fuck you. That's right. It's not my country. So I actually had a class, although they mostly taught me. It was a class of 25 African American veterans of World War II in Harlem. And they all worked in the post office. And I asked them at one point.
She wants me to move my car, don't you? Yeah. Yeah, I'm doing an interview. Can you guys pause?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely.
No, don't worry about it, David. But we're way over time.
I know. We're done. We're almost done.
Okay. Thank you. We should get that started over to the. So is somebody really going to listen to 3 hours of us?
Probably about 100,000.
That's a nice round number. Yeah. So you must edit it. So, but do you go on for 3 hours and people actually listen for 3 hours?
In this case, there will be no editing, and they will, I guarantee you, about 100,000 people will listen to it. Could be more.
Okay, so we're gonna finish up.
Finish this question, and then you can talk as long as you want and answer
okay.
to it, and that's it. And
Are we still going?
Yeah, we're just going.
Okay.
So let me just finish that question, and then you finish when you want to.
Okay.
Thank you for this, but
you're welcome.
So I was just talking about these black World War II vets. And I asked them, did you think of this as your war? And every single one of those men said, no, absolutely not. And it seemed to me as if they were also saying it wasn't really their country, which of course makes perfect sense given the history of African Americans at that time. So, okay, so I'm sure you agree with this. You have a disenfranchised group of people, a population, legally and culturally, okay? And then what you do is you make several things illegal. You make drugs illegal. You make alcohol for a time illegal. You make prostitution illegal. You make gambling illegal. And then you say, well, only the bad people, immigrants or the N-words, do those things. So this will be fine. Who do you think is going to fill the black markets that are created by those prohibitions? So in this country, very puritanical country, at least on that level, at the sort of formal level, right? The school teachers, what they tell us, what the government officials tell us, right? Very puritanical. And so they enforce those laws. Most countries have those laws, but the United States has enforced those laws. I was in a debate with Heather McDonald a few months ago in New York City, and this is what I presented to her, and it was as if she had never heard of this argument before about black markets and who might fill them in the United States of America. So it is clear that we have enforced those laws more stringently than in most countries over the last 100 or so years. I mean, sure, there's Singapore, but over the last 100 years, we really lock people up. We take it seriously when people deal drugs. This is not news to you or anybody listening, right? Prostitution, we really lock those women up. The pimps, we really punish them. All the rest of it. Gambling, you can't do that, right? We don't play around here. And we built all these prisons over the last 100 years, and you can see the long spike of mass incarceration. A lot of people start the narrative in the 1960s, and that's not wrong, but it begins after 1906 in the Food and Drug Act, when they made opium essentially illegal. No one knows this. And right after that, the newspapers are reporting on this new emergence of these criminals, most of them black and immigrant, in our cities who are selling these drugs, like opium, on the streets, and people don't understand why all of a sudden there's crime and violence on our streets. So that continues, of course, all the way through the 20th century. And by the 1960s, black people are operating in a world that is unpoliced, largely, like your neighborhood. They've been told this is not their country, and they can make a lot of money. And this is about the only way, because the post office pays pretty well, but it don't pay like it does a drug dealer or a pimp. So they start filling that black market in large numbers. They were always in it, but by then they really start filling it. And the thing is, they fill it, but it's the bad people in your neighborhood, the people who are violent. It's the people who want guns, who would be happy to kill someone for money. That's who fills black markets. It's whatever bad people there are. So immigrants have done that, of all colors. And then, so that's, you see, and then in the 1960s, you see other people in neighborhoods like Southside Chicago, black people, saying, hey, hello, we got drug runners on our corner with guns, and they're shooting us. They're shooting people all night long. We're hearing shots. Put some police in here. And that's when you see, as you know, this massive influx of police into those neighborhoods. And that's when everyone agrees the mass incarceration really begins. So what I'm suggesting to you is, maybe if we lived in a world in which you weren't arrested for having cocaine in your car, and we didn't lock up all those people for violating all these prohibitions of basically pleasure. In every case, it's pleasure. Coming back to the juke joint in African-American history around that, maybe we would have a lot fewer people in prison. I'm dying to know what Glenn Loury has to say about that.
I want to say sure. I mean, I want to acknowledge my agreement with a number of aspects of what you just laid out. That, for example, the persons recruited into the black commerce, that is the off-the-books commerce, the illicit commerce, are more likely than not to be coming from the margins of society for straightforward economic reasons. If there are alternative activities are not as remunerative, they are going to find it relatively more attractive to take the risk. But maybe also for cultural reasons. If they're already understanding themselves as marginal and outsiders, it's going to be them who will be engaging in the transgressive and illicit behaviors that are contra social norm, but they've already been excommunicated in effect, so they don't necessarily think the norms are as meaningful for themselves. So that makes sense to me. I would add to that. I would say, what I want, if I want an open air drug market, for example, is low social capital. I want anonymity. I want to be able to get in and out easy. I want low attention of the police. And I think that was an important aspect of what you were saying. I want it to be a kind of nether zone that I can go to and transact that kind of business. I mean, it's a little bit like, if I want to go out to, if I want to go to a strip club, if I want to go someplace and have sex for money or something like that, I don't want that in the newspaper. I don't want that getting back to people whose opinions of me I care about. I want to be in a space where that's not going to happen for me. And if I've got a group that's kind of at the margins and are not, necessarily on the radar screen of the main society, I mean, that's where I'm going to go. And moreover, if there's this cultural attraction, I mean, I'm thinking about Harlem in the 1920s and what that meant for people coming from Columbia University across the
slumming,
110th Street to get up to the, where the juke joints were and the parties were and the whatnot, and people letting their hair down and all that kind of stuff. So I see that. I wanted to, however, say, I don't know if you've seen James Foreman's book, Locking Up Our Own.
I heard your interview with him.
Yeah. It's a book's worth attention. This is a history of Washington, D.C. in the 60s and 70s and 80s. It's heroin, not crack cocaine, that is the drug that's getting the attention of law enforcement authorities, and that's creating some havoc, with people breaking into people's houses and stealing their televisions or robbing them at gunpoint on the street or whatever. And the ministers and decent and law-abiding black people are demanding more attention from the police to this thing, and the black judges are sending kids off to punitive detention when they might have given them a break because they feel like the kids are betraying the ideals of the civil rights movement. There's a lot of respectability politics. It makes the black community look bad for you people to be doing this and so on. And it's black people who are doing it. I wanted to say that the bad actors are always a minority of the population in these communities.
Sure.
Even though the distance between a certifiable bad actor on the one hand and a guy that likes to snort a little heroin or cocaine on a Saturday night on the other is not necessarily all that great. And cousins, brothers, uncles, etc., are going to be, walking one side of the street, walking the other side of the street, and maybe sometimes the same person is going to be go home, take off the tie, and put on the print shirt.
You don't need that many people to kill 700 kids.
Yeah, I guess that's right. And
it's a minority. Of
and
course
it
is.
It is a very
but it can be a
activity.
very lethal minority.
I wanted to say that the prisons are not just full of people who've been arrested for drugs. We've got violent crime. We've got property crime. We've got rape and assault. These are also things that people are doing and they're getting locked up for. So while our incarcerated population is too large and while the war on drugs is bad public policy, in my opinion, the idea that the racial footprint of mass incarceration is due primarily to the war on drugs is not. I don't believe that's true.
So Heather McDonald said something similar to me, and I gave her a fact that she seemed unaware of. Actually, I take that back. She was unaware of it, which is why I was curious why she had not integrated it into her own analysis, which is that according to the FBI, about 50% of violent crimes now are being committed by members of gangs whose reason for existence is drug dealing. So it seems to me it's possible that if we simply and only legalize drugs, we could eliminate 50% of those bodies.
Okay. I mean, I'm open to that, and I hadn't heard the statistic, but I'm not. I mean, we know that violence is going to accompany trade in an illicit substance, since business dealings can't be governed by legitimate contractual enforcement. They can't go to court. They can't call the cops if somebody delivers a package to me that's not what I paid them the $100,000 to deliver. They're messing with my money. And, there's got to be a consequence for that, because I'll be broke quick if I let people mess with my money and there are no consequences. Well, who can I call? Mm-hmm. I'm going to call Strong Arm. I'm going to call some muscle to deal with that particular situation. And I'm going to try to establish a reputation of being quick to call muscle. Mm-hmm. If I've got an inventory that's worth 5 figures in my trunk, and I don't have a way of protecting it from somebody who puts a pistol in my face to take my shit, I'm not going to be in business for very long. So it's just logical that there's going to be violence, which is one reason why I don't like this nonviolent offender designation, so that we're going to do prison reform for nonviolent offenders. Mm-hmm. I'm not for violence. I don't want to be misunderstood. I'm definitely against violence. I think I've already gone on the record to that effect. What I'm saying, however, is that if you're in a certain line of work, like trafficking in illicit substances, there's going to be a pistol nearby. Okay, there has to be, because that's the way in which you keep yourself and your product safe. So a lot of these violent offenders are really not any different. They're just a nonviolent offender who hasn't had to pull the pistol and use it yet, kind of thing like that. I mean, anyway, I'm not sure the discrimination between violent offender and nonviolent offender does the work for us that we wanted to do. We wanted to designate really bad people who don't warrant any amelioration of the sentence or whatever from reformable people. And I don't believe that the violent-nonviolent correlation and the really bad reformable distinction are that highly connected with each other. There are going to be a lot of false negatives and a lot of false, the guy who didn't fire the pistol is going to be a really bad guy sometimes. The guy who actually fired the pistol is going to be an okay person sometimes. And I hate that so much rides on that distinction. But I'm saying all that to say, violence is a part and parcel of the trade when you're underground, when you're off the books, when you're in the black spaces of human interaction. Violence is a part of that, because you don't have civil law. There's no place to resolve disputes except by force.
Yep. I always knew that you were perhaps uniquely qualified to understand that argument as an economist, and because of your history in many ways. So I'm not surprised you not only got it, because a lot of people don't get it when I tell them this, but you also sort of reinterpreted it in your own words. And so thank you. I finally got to do that. And I appreciate it. And
Very good. Thanks.
And I just want to say thank you so much for all of your time today and for doing what you do. This was the Unregistered podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. If you like what you just heard and think it's worth supporting, please go to unregisteredunderground.com and become a subscriber. Thanks for listening.